Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. Shadow among the sands. It all started with the heat. The kind of heat that pressed down on you like a heavy blanket, suffocating and relentless. The air shimmered above the cracked earth of the Arizona desert, making everything appear distorted, as if the world itself was dissolving into a mirage. I had been driving for hours, the road stretching endlessly before me, the barren landscape offering nothing but dust and the occasional silhouette of a cactus. It was supposed to be a simple trip. A quiet, solitary drive across the desert to clear my head. But something about the emptiness of this place gnawed at me. The silence was almost too much to bear, as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, I chalked it up to fatigue. After all, I hadn't seen another car for miles. But as the minutes passed, I noticed something strange. A flicker in the corner of my eye. A shadow that seemed to move just out of reach, always just beyond my line of sight. I would glance in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing there, only the endless stretch of road behind me. I told myself it was nothing. The desert played tricks on your mind, especially when you've been driving alone for too long. The isolation can make you question everything. But the feeling wouldn't go away. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sand, turning the world into a distorted painting of orange and red. My eyes were starting to feel heavy, but I kept driving, trying to push the unease from my mind. And that's when I heard it. A faint noise, almost imperceptible at first. Like a soft scraping sound, far behind me. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, but nothing had changed. The road was still empty, the same as it had been for the last few hours. I tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder. A scraping that was slowly becoming more defined. Then, the unmistakable sound of something heavy dragging along the asphalt. My heart skipped a beat. I hit the brakes instinctively, my eyes scanning the road behind me. Nothing. The road was still empty, stretching out into the darkening desert. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that was clouding my mind. It was just the wind, I told myself. Just the desert playing tricks on me. But the sound, it had been so real. So close. I pressed on the gas again, the engine humming louder as I picked up speed. But the scraping sound didn't fade. It followed me, growing steadily louder with each mile. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't alone on this stretch of desert road. Something was out there, something that was watching me. I couldn't decide if I was more afraid of the creature that I was certain was following me, or the overwhelming, suffocating sense that I was losing my grip on reality. I kept checking the mirrors, hoping for some sign of another car or a distant light. But there was nothing. Just the emptiness of the desert, stretching out forever. The temperature dropped suddenly, and a chill ran down my spine. The night was settling in, but it wasn't just the cold that was unsettling. There was something about the darkness that felt wrong. The world around me seemed to shrink, the vast expanse of the desert now closing in on me, pressing me down. And then, I saw it. A shape in the distance. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fading light. But as I approached, it became clearer. A figure standing motionless by the side of the road. I slowed the car, my heart racing in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge my presence as I passed. I tried to force myself to look away, but my eyes were glued to it, the shape growing clearer as I drew closer. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to twist and bend in unnatural ways. Its body was almost skeletal, its form covered in dark, tattered cloth. I couldn't make out its face, but the way it stood, unmoving and silent, sent a wave of terror through me. And then, as I passed, it moved. Not a slow, deliberate movement, but a sudden, jerking lunge toward the car. My foot slammed on the gas, the engine roaring to life as I sped away, my heart pounding in my chest. But the thing, whatever it was, kept pace with me. I didn't dare look back, not wanting to confirm the nightmare that was unfolding behind me. I pressed harder on the accelerator, the desert landscape blurring as I raced through the night. The sound of the scraping, that dragging sound, was now unmistakable, echoing in my ears as if the creature was right there, just inches from the car. I had to get away. But no matter how fast I drove, the shadows seemed to be right there, always behind me, its presence growing heavier with every passing moment. And then, as the road ahead twisted into a curve, the lights flickered. The engine sputtered. My car jerked forward as if something had grabbed hold of it, pulling it toward the dark, endless horizon. The radio crackled, a distorted voice coming through, faint but clear. Stop. It was the last thing I heard before the world went dark. When I woke up, I was no longer in the car. The world around me was still. Quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like a suffocating weight pressing down on your chest, making it hard to breathe. My head throbbed, a dull, persistent ache that seemed to pulse with every beat of my heart. My hands were gripped tight to something rough, cold, and unfamiliar. I tried to move, but the sensation of being trapped hit me all at once. My body felt heavy, stiff, as though I had been lying there for hours, maybe even days. My eyes fluttered open, and the dim light of early morning filtered through cracks in the ceiling above me. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and decay. I was inside a building, but not one I recognized. The walls were made of stone, crumbling in places, as if the structure had been abandoned long ago. The floor beneath me was hard, covered in sand and grit. I could feel the coolness of the ground seeping into my bones. My throat was dry, my lips cracked from dehydration. I tried to sit up, but immediately regretted it. A wave of dizziness swept over me, and I had to steady myself by gripping the stone floor. My head swam with confusion, and for a moment, I wondered if I was still dreaming. But no! This felt all too real. The car. The shadow. The voice. It all came rushing back in an instant, and I scrambled to my feet, panic rising in my chest. The events from last night, if it even was last night, flashed through my mind in a chaotic blur. The thing in the desert. The creature that had followed me. The sound of its dragging steps. The voice on the radio. I shuddered, my breath coming in short gasps as I tried to make sense of it all. I staggered to the edge of the room, my feet crunching on the dry sand beneath me. There were no windows, no doors, only walls that seemed to close in around me. I was trapped. I searched the room for any clue, any sign of what had happened, but all I found was a small, weathered table in the corner, its surface covered in dust. There was a single, rusted chair pushed beneath it. On the table lay something that made my blood run cold. A piece of paper, folded neatly, as though it had been placed there deliberately. I reached for it, my hands trembling, and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was jagged, erratic, as though written in haste. It read, "You're not alone. It knows you're here. It won't stop until you see it." A chill ran down my spine as I read the words over and over. I didn't understand what they meant, but I knew one thing for sure: this wasn't a place for anyone to be. I turned my attention to the only possible exit, a narrow door set into the far wall. I moved toward it slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got, the more I could hear. A faint, scratching sound, like nails against wood. I stopped, frozen in place. It was the same sound from the night before. The scraping. The door creaked open just a few inches, and I hesitated, unsure of what awaited me on the other side. My hand hovered over the handle, but I could feel something pulling me toward it. A compulsion, a desperate need to find out what was happening. With a shaky breath, I pushed the door open and stepped into the hallway. The air here was even heavier, thick with the scent of rot. The dim light from an overhead bulb flickered weakly, casting long shadows that seemed to move and sway of their own accord. The walls were cracked and weathered, as if this place had been abandoned for years. And yet, there was something about it, something that didn't feel quite right. I took a step forward. Then another. My footsteps echoed in the silence, each one amplified by the oppressive stillness of the building. Suddenly, a sound. A low thud, followed by another. And then a whisper, just barely audible. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. I wasn't alone. I turned to face the source of the sound, my body tense with fear. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening, but the more I tried to make sense of it, the more it slipped through my fingers. Was this real? Was I losing my mind? The sound came again, closer this time. The scraping. The dragging. It was behind me. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, stretching out into the darkness. My eyes darted back and forth, scanning every corner, every shadow. But the longer I stared, the more the shadows seemed to grow, twisting and warping as if they were alive. The feeling of being watched intensified, suffocating, as if unseen eyes were boring into me from the darkness. And then I heard it. A voice. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. "It's here." The words sent a jolt of terror through me. I wanted to run, to escape, but my feet felt glued to the floor. I could hear the scraping again, getting louder now, closer. And then, from the corner of the hallway, I saw it. The shadow. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form stretching unnaturally long as it emerged from the darkness. It moved with a fluid, predatory grace, dragging its limbs along the floor. Its face was a void, an endless, black expanse where eyes should be. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My mouth was dry, my heart thundering in my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The shadow advanced toward me, its shape growing clearer with every step, until it was standing right in front of me. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating, as if it was drawing all the air from the room. And then, in a voice that sent chills down my spine, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The air felt thick with dread, pressing down on me like 1,000 invisible hands. My body refused to move, every muscle frozen in terror. The shadow was inches from me now, its form tall and impossibly thin, stretching unnaturally. I could feel the temperature drop, a biting cold creeping over my skin. It wasn't just the chill of the desert night, it was something deeper, something that sank into my bones. The voice echoed in my mind, reverberating like a low, guttural whisper. You shouldn't have come. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, parched, as though the very air around me had stolen all moisture from my body. My heartbeat thundered in my chest, each beat a loud reminder of the desperate fear that gripped me. My eyes fixed on the shape before me, trying to make sense of it, but the more I looked, the more it seemed to blur and distort. What is it? I thought desperately, my mind scrambling for some logical explanation, but there was none. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive, not in the way I understood life. It was something else. Something ancient. And it was here, with me. The shadow moved again, its limbs jerking at strange, unnatural angles. It reached out toward me, a long, skeletal arm that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of physics. The scraping sound intensified, as if its fingers were dragging across the floor, leaving a trail of coldness behind them. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me, my vision spinning. I staggered backward, trying to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, and no matter where I turned, the shadow was always there, just out of reach, yet closing in. Run, I thought, but my body refused to obey. I couldn't move. The creature's presence seemed to paralyze me, to draw every ounce of energy from my body, until all I could do was stand there, trembling. You can't escape, the shadow whispered, its voice now louder, more forceful. You're already part of it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to deny it, to fight, but the words stuck in my throat. The shadow loomed closer, its form swirling like smoke, yet impossibly solid. There was no way to fight it. No way to outrun it. The terror that gripped my chest tightened with every passing second. And then, something inside me snapped. I couldn't let this thing consume me. Not without understanding what it was. Not without knowing why it had chosen me. I wasn't just going to stand here and die without answers. The shadow seemed to notice the change in my resolve. It paused, its presence looming over me like a heavy weight, as though waiting for something. I looked into the darkness of its face, or lack of face, and felt something stir in the pit of my stomach. What are you? I managed to choke out, my voice ragged, barely a whisper. For a moment, there was silence. The air around me felt unnaturally still, and the scraping ceased. The shadow's form flickered, like a glitch in the fabric of reality, and then, in a voice so low it was almost inaudible, it answered. I am the desert's thirst. The words sank into my mind like a cold knife, and I shuddered. The desert's thirst? What did that mean? I had never heard such words, never understood such a concept. But I could feel it now, that ancient, gnawing hunger in the air, that unrelenting pull of something beyond the world I knew. The land, the shadow continued, its voice now swirling around me like a wind, has always been hungry. For those who wander. For those who dare cross its borders. It takes, and it never gives. I tried to comprehend what it was saying, but my mind felt fogged, disconnected from reality. The shadow was more than just a creature. It was a manifestation of something deeper, something older. A force of nature, perhaps, or something far worse. It was as if the desert itself had come alive, driven by some ancient hunger that had nothing to do with the sun or the sand. You're not the first, the shadow rasped. The others, they came before you. They wandered the same path, seeking answers in a place they didn't belong. And they disappeared. Like you will. My heart skipped a beat. The others. There had been others. People who had come here, perhaps driven by curiosity or desperation, and had vanished into the nothingness of the desert. Had they encountered this same creature? Had they been consumed by it, just like the shadow claimed I would be? Why me? I croaked. What do you want from me? The shadow's form twisted, its limbs contorting in strange angles as it came closer. My body trembled with fear, but I forced myself to stay rooted to the spot, unable to look away. You sought the road, it whispered, and the road led you here. But the road doesn't end. Not here. Not for you. The words made no sense. My mind spun, trying to latch onto anything that could explain it. The road? What was it talking about? You'll stay with us, the shadow said, its voice growing louder, more urgent, forever. Until the desert finds a new wanderer. I stumbled backward, panic flooding my veins. The idea of being trapped here, in this desolate place, was more terrifying than anything I had ever faced. I could feel the coldness of the creatures surrounding me, suffocating me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My mind was slipping away, overwhelmed by the weight of the shadow's presence. And then, I realized the truth. The creature wasn't just here to kill me. It was here to claim me. To make me a part of the desert's eternal hunger. My body screamed for escape, but it was too late. The shadow closed in, and the world went black. I woke again in darkness. At first, I couldn't move. I couldn't feel anything, as though my body had been reduced to nothing more than a faint memory. The suffocating blackness around me pressed in, wrapping me in a shroud of nothingness. My lungs burned, and my heart pounded with the panic of being trapped in some endless void. But then, slowly, my senses began to return, one by one. The first thing I noticed was the taste of dust on my lips, dry and bitter. Then came the scent, the sharp, earthy tang of sand mixed with something older, something like rot. I coughed, my throat rasping, and the sound echoed around me in the stillness. Where am I? I tried to open my eyes, but they felt heavy, as if they were sealed shut. Slowly, I forced them open, and at first, all I could see was the blackness. But gradually, as my eyes adjusted, a faint light began to appear. A flickering, weak light, like a candle struggling to stay alive. I was lying on the ground, my body cold and stiff. I tried to sit up, but pain shot through my limbs, as if I had been lying there for a long time. The air around me was thick with dust, and the temperature had dropped significantly. It wasn't the heat of the desert anymore. It was something colder. Foul. I pushed myself up, my hands shaking, and blinked as the faint light grew stronger. I was in a cave. A tunnel. The walls were rough and jagged, covered in the grime of years, maybe centuries of neglect. The ground beneath me was uneven, the sand crunching underfoot as I struggled to my feet. Where was I? What had happened? Had I been taken? The events from before came rushing back, the shadow, the voice, the desert that seemed to have swallowed me whole. I could still feel it, that crushing weight of the shadow's presence, the way it had surrounded me, its cold fingers tightening around my soul. I tried to shake the memory off, but it clung to me like a wet blanket. I wasn't sure if I was still dreaming. Was I still trapped? Was this some kind of afterlife? Or was it real, this place, this darkness, This endless void that felt like it was both inside me and outside, consuming everything. My breath quickened, and I took a step forward, my hands pressing against the walls of the cave for support. The light ahead of me flickered again, and I hesitated. Should I follow it? Or was it just another trick? Another illusion meant to lure me deeper into this nightmare? I had no choice. I moved toward the light, my heart thudding louder with each step. The air grew colder, heavier, and the sound of my footsteps seemed to reverberate off the walls, stretching into the void. I felt as though I was walking through a tunnel that had no end. Then, just as I reached the source of the light, I saw something that made my blood freeze. It was a mirror. A tall, withered mirror, standing alone in the center of the cave, its surface cracked and streaked with age. The dim light cast strange, distorted shadows on its frame, making it appear as though it were alive, breathing. The reflection in the mirror was blurry at first, but then it cleared. It was me. But not exactly. My face was pale, gaunt, the eyes sunken and hollow, staring back at me with an expression that wasn't mine. I reached out, trembling, my reflection mimicking my every move. But then it moved. The reflection grinned. I stumbled backward, a cold wave of horror washing over me. My reflection's grin widened, its lips pulling back too far, exposing teeth that were too sharp, too jagged. Its eyes never left mine, cold and unblinking, as if it were watching me, studying me, waiting for something. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The reflection seemed to come alive in the glass, twisting and distorting in unnatural ways. It reached forward, pressing its hand against the mirror as I did. I could feel the cold of the glass through my fingers, but it was as if the mirror was pulling at me, drawing me closer to its dark, empty surface. This isn't real. I tried to convince myself. It can't be real. But deep down, I knew the truth. The desert hadn't just taken me. It had taken my soul. It had made me part of it. The mirror was a reflection of what I had become, an echo of the void, a fragment of the land's unyielding hunger. A voice, low and almost inaudible, whispered from behind me. It's not over. I spun around, my heart slamming into my chest, but the cave was empty. The cold air brushed against my skin, sending shivers down my spine. I looked back at the mirror. The reflection was still there, staring at me with that same twisted grin. I tried to back away, to turn and run, but something held me in place. The air had thickened, and the walls of the cave seemed to close in, tightening around me like a vice. The mirror had become the center of everything, drawing me back toward it, and with every step I took away, it felt as though the cave was pulling me in. The whisper came again, louder this time, "It knows you." I couldn't escape. The cave was no longer just a place. It was a prison, a trap set by the desert, by the shadow that had claimed me. I wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever. And then I heard the scraping again. It was distant at first, but it was unmistakable. The sound of dragging, of something or someone moving closer. Closer to me. My heart pounded harder. The shadow was near. It was coming for me. And it wasn't going to let me go. The reflection in the mirror shifted, its grin growing wider, sharper. The last thing I saw before the darkness claimed me again was its empty eyes, staring straight into my soul. And the scraping grew louder. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. I felt as if I were sinking into it, being swallowed whole by the desert itself. My body moved as though it were no longer mine, slow, sluggish, dragging me deeper into the abyss. The light from the mirror faded into nothingness, and the silence of the cave was broken only by the growing scrape of something dragging closer, inexorably. I couldn't breathe. Every inhale felt like I was choking on dust, on the weight of everything I'd seen. The darkness seemed to swallow the very thoughts in my head, turning them into distant echoes that barely reached my ears. And yet, through it all, I knew one thing: the shadow was coming. It's here. I heard the whisper, but it wasn't the shadow's voice. No, this time it came from inside me, from my own mind. The realization crashed into me, shattering the last pieces of hope I had left. I wasn't just trapped in this cave, in this desert, I was part of it. The ground beneath me shifted, and I stumbled, my hands reaching out to steady myself against the walls of the tunnel. The cold had become unbearable now, seeping into my bones, my very marrow. The desert wasn't just a place. It was alive. It was a force. And it had taken me. I reached out, desperate to feel something real, but there was nothing. Just the same empty stretch of darkness. And then I heard it again, the scraping. This time, it was different. It was closer, more distinct, more alive. Something, or someone, was moving in the shadows, its movements deliberate, its presence crushing. I forced myself to move, my legs stiff and uncooperative, each step an effort of will. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My throat was raw, as though I had screamed myself hoarse long ago. I was trapped between the reality I had known and the nightmare I had become. Suddenly, a flash of light burst through the darkness, blinding me for a moment. I blinked, my eyes watering, and when the light cleared, I saw it. A figure. A silhouette in the distance, standing at the edge of the tunnel. I staggered toward it, my breath ragged, desperate to escape. But the figure didn't move. It stood motionless, waiting. And as I approached, I realized with a cold shock that it was me. Or, at least, it looked like me. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart racing, mind spinning. The figure mirrored my every movement, staring back at me with those hollow eyes, that expression that wasn't quite mine, but still felt like me. No. This can't be real. But I knew it was. The desert had taken me, but not in the way I had imagined. The thing that had stalked me, stalked all of us, had taken pieces of us, fragments of our very essence, and folded them into the endless hunger of the land. It fed on us, absorbed us, and in return, it gave us nothing. I reached out a trembling hand toward the figure. My reflection in its eyes was the only thing that remained real to me now. And then, it moved. The figure stepped forward, its face twisting into the same jagged grin I had seen in the mirror. I felt a shiver of recognition. It wasn't just a reflection. It was me. Or at least, it had been. It took another step, and this time, the darkness seemed to pull at me, wrapping itself around me like a suffocating blanket. I tried to scream, to fight, but it was no use. The desert had already claimed me. My reflection reached out, and I felt its cold touch on my skin. And then, everything went black. I don't know how long I was gone. How long I existed in that void, trapped between worlds, between realities. Time had no meaning here. When I finally opened my eyes again, I was back on the road. The same road that had brought me here, to this place, to this hell. The desert stretched endlessly before me, the sand shimmering under the harsh, unforgiving sun. I blinked, trying to make sense of it all. The road was the same. The sky was the same. But I wasn't. I wasn't me anymore. The shadow had taken everything, my body, my soul, my mind. It had broken me into pieces and scattered them across the land, feeding its endless hunger. The desert had consumed me, just as it had consumed so many others before me. And now, I was part of it. I felt a tug at the back of my mind, a whisper that urged me forward, down the same road I had traveled before. The road that had led me to my doom. There was no escape. Not anymore. I turned away from the road, my eyes drawn to the horizon. The desert called to me, beckoning me to walk once more. The shadow would be waiting, just as it always had. Just as it always would. And in the distance, I could hear it. The scraping. It was coming. And it would never stop. The city without witnesses. I should have known something was wrong the moment I stepped off the subway. The city, the streets, everything seemed familiar, yet it wasn't. I had taken the wrong exit, or so I thought, but when I glanced at the signs, they didn't match anything I had seen on the subway map. The words on the street signs were unfamiliar, distorted almost, as if someone had tried to erase them but hadn't quite managed. I was tired. It had been a long day at work, and I just wanted to get home, but curiosity got the better of me. The place felt like any ordinary part of New York, but something about it unsettled me. I could hear the hum of distant traffic, the distant chatter of people, but I couldn't see them. It was like the air was thick with anticipation, holding its breath. I looked around, hoping to find a familiar face, but the street was empty. I thought I must have taken a wrong turn, but even the usual sounds of the city, honking horns, footsteps, were muted, almost as if the street was soundproofed. The shops were closed, their windows reflecting nothing but the faint streetlights. No advertisements. No flickering neon. Just emptiness. I should have turned back then, but something about the silence, how unnatural it felt, pulled me forward. I walked down the street, each step echoing louder than the last, making the emptiness even more apparent. At the end of the street, there was an alleyway. A narrow, shadowed passage between two buildings. A strange compulsion urged me to take it. I don't know why, but I did. The alley smelled stale, like something old had been hidden there for years. As I walked further into it, the lights above flickered and then went out entirely. The darkness pressed in around me, but I didn't feel fear. It was more like curiosity, a need to explore. And then I saw it. The city, or what looked like a city, a part of it. It wasn't on any map. It didn't belong in the grid of New York. Yet, there it was, an entire section of buildings, streets that curved in on angles, towers that seemed to stretch too high. There were no windows, no signs of life, but the city was undeniably there, hovering just beyond the alley, like it was waiting for me to enter. It didn't seem possible, but then again, nothing about this place seemed possible. It was as if it had been placed just out of sync with reality. I hesitated for a moment, but then something pulled me in. I stepped forward, my feet crunching against the gravel beneath them. It was quiet. Too quiet. There wasn't even a wind. The air was thick and still, pressing against me with a weight I couldn't explain. As I walked deeper into the strange city, I could hear the faintest sounds, a low hum, a whisper just on the edge of my hearing. But no one was around. The buildings around me were strange, too. They looked like something out of a dream, tall, angular, and made of materials I didn't recognize. The sky above me had taken on an eerie grayish hue, and the air felt charged, like something was just about to happen. I tried to tell myself this was just a trick of the mind, that I had wandered into some forgotten corner of the city where old buildings had been abandoned, where the laws of physics didn't quite hold. But the more I walked, the more I felt the weight of something unseen watching me. It wasn't just the silence, it was the absence of something. People, objects, the usual hum of the city, they were all gone. It was as if this place had been cut out of the real world, an empty echo left behind. I rounded a corner and stopped dead. There, in the distance, I saw something that sent a chill down my spine, a figure, standing completely still. It was just a shape, a dark outline, but I could feel its presence. Something about it seemed wrong. Its proportions were slightly off, like it didn't belong to this world. For a moment, I thought I saw it move, but then it was still again. I couldn't tell if it was watching me or if it was simply waiting. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back, but I was already too far in. I couldn't bring myself to leave. Something was pulling me forward. I continued walking, my feet heavy, my heart racing. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. My thoughts began to swirl, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was I dreaming? Was this some sort of alternate dimension? The figure didn't move. I reached for my phone to call someone, anyone, but my screen was black. I checked the time, but the numbers were wrong, distorted. They twisted and blurred, and when I looked away and back again, they had changed. The city, the streets, everything was changing around me. It was like it was shifting, not in a way I could see, but in a way I could feel. I wasn't sure how long I had been walking, but as I turned a corner, the city began to feel less like a place and more like a maze. The streets stretched, turned, split off in directions that didn't make sense. Every time I looked over my shoulder, the alley I had come through was gone, replaced by more buildings, more streets, more of it. The noise had begun. A low murmur, like the city was coming to life. The sound grew louder, but it was distant, like it came from the walls themselves, the very ground beneath my feet. It wasn't the usual buzz of city life. No. It was deeper, primal, like something trying to emerge from the cracks of reality itself. I turned a corner and froze. A man was standing there, just ahead, looking straight at me. He was unremarkable, average height, a slight build, in plain clothes, but his face, it wasn't right. His expression was too blank, too still. And his eyes, dark, empty, like holes where light should be, stared at me with such intensity that I could feel them digging into my skin. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Then, the figure moved. Not quickly, but deliberately, slowly stepping toward me. I backed away, heart hammering, but no matter how far I went, it kept closing the distance. The air grew heavier, the hum louder. Something was coming. Something was waking up. I turned to run, but the city shifted again, the ground beneath me tilting, the buildings warping. Every step I took, I was pulled deeper into the labyrinth. I was trapped. There was no way out. The air was thick, heavier now, pressing against my chest as if the very atmosphere of this strange place was alive. I could feel it watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. There were no sounds of life, no passing cars, no chatter, not even the usual hum of city machines. The stillness was suffocating. I looked back. The figure was gone. There was no trace of him, no footsteps, no sign of movement. The street was as empty as it had been before. but I knew he was still there, somewhere, watching me. I stumbled forward, trying to make sense of what was happening. My mind raced, but it couldn't keep up with the overwhelming sensation of something being off. The city around me seemed to breathe with an unnatural rhythm, every corner I turned bringing more disorientation. I found myself standing at another intersection. The buildings here looked even stranger, as if they didn't quite match the architecture of New York. The windows were too narrow, the walls too smooth, the angles too sharp. It was as though someone had taken familiar elements of the city and twisted them into something wrong, something unrecognizable. I couldn't see anyone else. Not a single soul moved in these streets, not even a stray animal. Just the oppressive silence, broken only by my own footsteps. I tried calling someone again, but once more, my phone screen remained black. The time was still wrong, the digits unrecognizable, as if time itself was confused here. What is this place? I could feel my pulse quicken, my breath becoming shallow. The air seemed to grow denser with each passing second. I knew I should leave, turn around, and run. But there was nowhere to go. The city stretched endlessly in all directions, each street leading me further away from the real world, from any kind of understanding. I felt the ground beneath my feet shift slightly, as though the city itself was shifting, reconfiguring its streets while I wasn't looking. I couldn't trust anything here, not even the pavement beneath me. At the end of the block, a door stood open, leading into one of the buildings. I didn't know why, but something about it seemed like a refuge. A way out. I entered, the door creaking behind me. Inside, the building was dark, but the shadows seemed to move, to twist in ways they shouldn't. I reached for the light switch, but the room flickered dimly, revealing rows of shelves. Books. The smell of dust. It felt like an old, forgotten library, except for the strange, muffled echo of my footsteps that seemed to come from far away. I walked deeper inside, my footsteps cautious, as if afraid that something would spring out of the shadows. And then, I saw it. A figure. A woman, standing perfectly still, her back to me. Her clothes were ordinary, nothing out of place, but her stillness was unnatural. She didn't move a muscle, not even when I approached. I swallowed hard, the tension building in my chest. Was she real? Was this a person, or something else? I took another step forward, but then something caught my eye. There, on the shelf beside her, was a photograph. I reached for it, my hand trembling as I picked it up. The photo was blurry, but I could make out the faint outline of a street, one I recognized. It was a street from the real New York, not from this place. But there was something more unsettling about it. The street was empty. There were no people. Not a single car. No sign of life at all. It looked just like the street I had been on before I entered the alley. The same place, but different. Empty. Lifeless. Suddenly, I heard a sound behind me, a low, grating noise, like metal scraping against concrete. I spun around, but the woman was gone. The room was empty again. I didn't know why, but I started running. I ran back through the hallway, out the door, and back into the street. The city had changed again. The buildings were closer now, the shadows darker. The streets twisted, stretched, and I couldn't remember the path I had taken to get here. It was as if the city itself was reconfiguring itself around me, trapping me in an endless loop. I stopped and turned in a panic. The street I had just run down was gone. The buildings around me shifted, their angles changing so quickly that my eyes couldn't keep up. The silence was deafening. Then I heard it. A whisper. Soft at first, like a breeze. It wasn't coming from any direction. It was everywhere. Leave. I froze. The voice wasn't familiar, but it felt like it came from deep within the walls of this place. My head swam as I tried to make sense of it. It was a warning. I could feel it in my bones. Leave. Leave now. But leave where? There was nowhere to go. No way out. I felt a sudden pull, like gravity was changing direction, dragging me toward one of the buildings ahead. I tried to resist, but the force was too strong. The doors in front of me opened of their own accord, and I was pulled inside. My legs felt heavy, and the air grew thick, as though I was wading through water. The walls seemed to close in, distorting, bending. I stumbled into the building, heart racing, mind racing, and then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. The room was dim, lit only by a single hanging bulb. The walls were bare, save for a few cracked windows that let in faint light. There was no exit, no way out. I was trapped again. And that was when I realized something terrifying. The room wasn't empty. At the far corner, standing motionless, was a figure. A man, much like the one I had seen earlier. But now, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood more people. Men, women, all unmoving, all staring at me with empty eyes, their faces blank. There was no escape. I couldn't run. I couldn't scream. I couldn't leave. The figures in the corner remained perfectly still, their faces devoid of any emotion. Their eyes, however, those hollow, endless eyes, stared into me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I was surrounded now. The space around me seemed to shrink, and I felt it, the air, as if it were thick with something unnameable, suffocating me. There was no sound in this place, not even the subtle hum that had seemed to accompany my every step earlier. Everything had fallen into a deep, unnatural silence. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, my body aching with a cold dread that I couldn't explain. The figures didn't move. They didn't speak. They simply watched. Their stillness was more terrifying than anything I had encountered so far. I felt like I was in the middle of a storm, trapped in its eye, where time slowed, stretched, and distorted. I tried to move my legs, but they felt like they were cemented to the floor, too heavy to lift. I had to get out. But how? The walls, now that I was closer, seemed even stranger. They were smooth, too smooth, with an unnatural sheen to them, as if they were made of something not quite solid. The door I had entered through was gone. I turned, frantic, searching for any escape, but the more I searched, the more the space around me seemed to shift, grow, twist, rearranging itself. I stepped backward, desperate to find a way out, but my foot hit something, a sharp, cold edge. I glanced down. On the floor, just beyond the reach of the dim bulb's light, there was a crack. A small, barely noticeable gap in the flooring. I crouched down, my fingers trembling, and peered into the crack. At first, I thought it was just dirt or some broken part of the floor, but as I looked closer, I realized it was something more. There was a faint, pulsing light beneath the surface. The crack seemed to grow wider as I stared at it, almost like it was alive, responding to my gaze. I leaned in closer, my breath shallow, my mind racing. Then, as I reached out to touch it, the light beneath the crack flickered violently, as if it were warning me to stay away. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, a sharp, icy chill creeping up my spine. The air grew even heavier, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The figures in the corner, they were moving now. Not physically, but mentally. I could feel them, in my mind, watching me, pulling me into their gaze. And I heard it again. That whisper. Leave. The voice was no longer distant. It was right next to me, inside my head. It was a command. A demand. I recoiled from the crack, instinctively pulling my hand back. My pulse raced as I staggered to my feet, my mind scrambling for a way out. But there was nothing. No door, no window, no path leading anywhere. And then, I saw it. In the corner of my eye, the wall began to shift again. The shadows stretched, elongated, like they were bending on themselves. A door appeared, not like a real door, but more like an opening that had always been there, waiting. It was ajar, the faintest sliver of light spilling from the crack. A chance. A way out. I didn't hesitate. I ran toward the door. But as I reached for the handle, the figures shifted. They moved now, stepping forward in unison, their eyes following my every move. Their mouths opened, just slightly, and the same whisper echoed in my mind, this time louder, more desperate. You can't leave. I slammed my hand against the door, trying to push it open. The handle turned, but it felt wrong, resistant, as if the door itself was fighting me. A chill wrapped around me, freezing my fingers to the metal. I pulled harder, panic flooding my body, but the door wouldn't budge. The figures were closer now. Their empty eyes stared through me, as though they were pulling me into some deeper, darker place. Suddenly, the world around me shifted again. The walls bent. The floor twisted beneath me. I stumbled, falling to my knees, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room, the city, the world felt like it was falling apart. Pieces of the reality I knew were crumbling, folding, collapsing in on themselves. I couldn't focus. I couldn't think. The ground beneath me felt as though it was shifting, like I wasn't standing on solid earth, but rather something that wasn't quite real. I looked back at the figures. They were moving now, their limbs jerking in unnatural, stiff motions, their eyes following me with growing intensity. The whispers grew louder, filling my head. A chorus of voices now, all demanding, all screaming. Leave. 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 I felt like I was suffocating. The room, the city, everything was closing in on me. I couldn't escape it. My heart hammered in my chest, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. It felt like I was being pulled into something darker, deeper, something that would swallow me whole. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't. The door finally gave way. I didn't hesitate. I didn't care where it led. I shoved it open, and the world around me split apart. I was no longer in the building. I was outside. But the city, it was different now. The streets stretched out in ways that didn't make sense. The buildings were higher, the sky darker. The atmosphere was thick with something wrong, a heavy presence that pressed in from all sides. I ran. I didn't know where to, but I ran, the whispers fading behind me, but their presence, that feeling, remained. The city was alive now, moving with a strange energy, like it was aware of me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figures behind me, but there was no one. Just the empty streets. But then, I realized something. The streets weren't empty. They were full of eyes. The walls, the windows, the shadows, everything had eyes, and they were watching me. The entire city was alive in ways I couldn't comprehend. It was following me, studying me, waiting. And that's when I knew there was no way out. I couldn't escape the city. The streets twisted around me like a labyrinth with no exit, the buildings stretching higher and higher, suffocating the sky. The walls, the windows, even the cracks in the pavement, all of them seemed to be watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. The once familiar city now felt like a strange, living organism, its heartbeat syncing with mine. Every step I took, every breath I drew, the city pulsed in response, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. I stumbled forward, my legs weak, my mind a blur of panic and confusion. I tried to shake off the overwhelming sensation of being watched, but it was impossible. Everywhere I looked, the eyes were there, hidden in the cracks, staring from behind glass, flickering in the shadows. They were always watching. I couldn't outrun them. I couldn't hide. I turned a corner, desperate to find something, anything, that might lead me back to reality. But the moment I stepped onto the next street, I froze. The street was wrong. It wasn't just the buildings or the eerie silence that had settled in, it was the atmosphere, the weight of the air, the unnatural stillness. There were no shadows on the ground, only harsh, sharp light that made everything look flat, lifeless. I looked up. The sky was an unsettling shade of gray, as if it were trying to match the color of the pavement. No birds. No clouds. Just that oppressive, empty sky. And then I saw it. At the end of the street, there was a figure. It stood alone, just like the others, but this one was different. It was larger, its silhouette looming against the distorted horizon. It wasn't like the people I had seen earlier. This one wasn't human. The proportions were all wrong, its limbs too long, its head too large. It stood still, staring at me with those same dark, empty eyes. I felt my heart skip a beat. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. Something in me was drawn to it, like a magnet. The air around me grew colder, heavier. I took a step backward, but my legs refused to obey. I couldn't move. The figure didn't budge. It just watched. That's when I heard it again. The whisper. "You're not supposed to be here." It was a voice, but not a voice. It didn't come from anywhere I could pinpoint. It was in my head, like a thought, like something trying to break through from another world. The words were cold, sharp, and they sent a jolt of fear through my chest. I tried to move, to run, but my body felt heavy, as if the very air around me had thickened, holding me in place. The figure didn't speak again, but I could feel its presence, pressing in on me, filling every corner of my mind. It was like it knew me, like it understood my every fear and weakness, and it was using that to trap me. "You're not supposed to be here." The words repeated, growing louder, more insistent. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. And then it moved. The figure didn't walk. It shifted. One moment, it was standing at the end of the street, and the next, it was right in front of me. The air around it vibrated, as if it was distorting the very space it occupied. I could feel the weight of it, the force of it pressing against my chest, threatening to crush me under its unnatural presence. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Its face, a grotesque, distorted shape, loomed over me. The eyes were not just eyes. They were pits, dark and endless, pulling me in like black holes, consuming everything in their wake. You don't belong here." The words came again, louder now, and I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if something was tearing at the very core of me. I wanted to escape, but I couldn't. I couldn't run, couldn't scream. I was paralyzed by fear, trapped in this nightmarish world with no way out. The figure's mouth opened, stretching wide, impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp teeth, each one gleaming with an unnatural light. It leaned closer, its breath cold against my skin, and I felt its presence in my mind, like it was reaching inside me, trying to take something. I couldn't tell what. I gasped for air, my mind swirling, my thoughts disjointed and frantic. The figure wasn't just watching me anymore. It was inside me, its presence filling every corner of my mind, its voice echoing in my head. "You are mine." I staggered backward, my body finally responding to the terror that flooded my veins. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was tight, choking on the cold, empty air. The figure loomed over me, its shape warping, flickering like a broken image on a screen. I couldn't make sense of it anymore. It was like the very nature of reality was unraveling before my eyes, the lines between the world I knew and the world I was trapped in blurring beyond recognition. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The air lightened. The oppressive weight that had crushed me was suddenly gone. I was left standing in the street, gasping for breath, my hands trembling. I didn't know how long I stood there. Time didn't make sense anymore. It was like I was stuck in a loop, a never-ending cycle of fear, doubt, and confusion. But one thing was clear. The city was changing. It was alive, and it was pulling me deeper into its twisted, nightmare-like depths. The walls were closing in, and I had no idea how to escape. I couldn't breathe. The air felt suffocating, as if every molecule was thick with the weight of this place, this other world. The city had become more than just a strange, distorted landscape. It had become a living, breathing entity, one that was aware of me, aware of my every thought, every breath. There was no room for escape. Every street led me deeper into its maze, every corner turned only to reveal more of the same oppressive atmosphere. I walked on, my feet dragging, my mind numb with fear. There was no direction now, no hope of finding my way out. The walls, the buildings, they all seemed to lean in, pressing closer, enclosing me in a cage I couldn't see. And the whispers, the voices that had followed me from the moment I stepped into this nightmare, grew louder with each passing moment, like an endless chant, circling in my mind. "You're lost. You can never leave." The voice wasn't just in my head anymore. It was in the very air, vibrating through the ground beneath me, the buildings around me. It was alive, this place, and it was speaking to me. Its presence was everywhere, folding into the very fabric of this twisted reality. And then, just as I thought I might lose myself completely to the madness, I saw something that felt like a chance, a glimpse of hope. In the distance, at the far end of the street, there was a door. It wasn't like the others, nothing strange or unsettling about it. It was just there. I couldn't explain why, but I knew, deep down, that this was different. This was the way out. The escape I had been searching for. My heart skipped a beat, and for the first time since I had entered this nightmarish city, I felt something close to clarity. I had to get to that door. I started running, not caring anymore about the figures that might be watching, the whispers that grew louder in my ears. My steps echoed in the empty street, and the door seemed to grow closer with each stride, until it was within reach. I didn't hesitate. I ran straight for it, my hand outstretched, desperate to make contact, desperate to escape. I reached the door and pulled it open, my heart hammering in my chest, but nothing. The door wasn't an escape. It wasn't real. The moment I stepped through it, I found myself back on the same street. The same twisted, distorted city. The same suffocating air, the same empty buildings, the same watching eyes. I was still trapped. The door, the escape I had seen, had been an illusion, a cruel trick played by the city, by the thing that controlled this place. It was mocking me, pulling me deeper into its grasp. I staggered back, my mind reeling. I couldn't comprehend it. The city wasn't just a place, it was something else entirely. It wasn't a maze, it was a trap. And I was its prey. I heard it again, the whisper, now louder than ever. You cannot leave. The voice was like a scream or roar that shattered the silence around me. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my body trembling with fear. But I couldn't fight it anymore. I couldn't run. There was nowhere left to go. I turned around, my eyes frantically searching for some sign of escape, but the world around me had shifted again. The street was no longer familiar. The buildings twisted and warped, bending in ways that didn't make sense. The ground beneath me cracked, the concrete splintering like glass, and from the cracks, something dark and formless began to rise. It was the thing that had been following me. The thing that had watched me from the shadows, the thing that had pulled me into this place. It was here. And it was coming for me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, my body refusing to obey. The darkness spread faster, swallowing the light, until I could see nothing but the endless, empty void. And then I felt it, the pull. It was like the city itself was dragging me down, pulling me into the cracks in the ground, into the depths of its twisted, dark heart. The force was too strong. I tried to resist, but it was futile. I was being taken. I felt my body slip away, my senses fading, the world around me unraveling, until there was nothing left. The darkness consumed everything, the city, the buildings, the air. The city was no longer a place. It was an endless void. And I was lost in it. I couldn't tell where I ended and where the city began. There was no time, no space. Just the infinite emptiness. And then I heard one last whisper. No one ever leaves. The world went silent. The city had taken me, and I would never escape. Footprints on the water. I should have known the moment I set foot in those swamps that something wasn't right. But it's easy to dismiss the unsettling whispers of nature when you're desperate. And I was desperate. I had been working as a park ranger in the swamps of Louisiana for a few years, always fascinated by the deep, murky waters and the secrets they held. People often got lost out there. They'd wander off the paths, seduced by the eerie silence, only to never return. But that wasn't what made this time different. This time, it was the footprints. They hadn't been there before. It was the start of the rainy season when I first noticed them, faint impressions in the mud, leading from the edge of the swamp toward the water. At first, I thought they were animal tracks, maybe a bear or some kind of wildcat. But something about them felt wrong. They were too deep, too deliberate. And they didn't match any animals I had seen out there. The footprints led right to the water's edge, where the surface was unnaturally still. Even the usual hum of insects seemed muted, like they too were holding their breath. I knelt down, my fingers brushing against the wet earth, studying the marks in the soft mud. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe it was a lost hiker, or perhaps some local had taken a midnight stroll. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. I turned to look around. The dense trees loomed over me like silent sentinels, casting long shadows in the dim light of the late afternoon. The air felt heavy, thick with moisture. And then I heard it, a faint splash, barely audible over the soft wind, as though something had disturbed the stillness of the water. I snapped my head toward the lake. But there was nothing. Just the ripples slowly fading into the distance. I shook my head, trying to push down the growing unease. It was probably nothing. Just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I'd spent countless hours out here in the swamps. Nothing had ever felt dangerous, just strange. But the footprints, those deep, unnatural marks leading into the water, kept pulling at my thoughts. Something in me couldn't ignore them. I had to find out where they went. As I stepped forward, the air around me grew colder. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves above, but it felt wrong, too sudden, too unnatural. The temperature dropped by several degrees, and I felt my breath coming out in visible puffs. The water in front of me was dark, almost black, reflecting the trees in a way that didn't seem quite right. It was like the swamp itself was waiting, holding its breath, waiting for me to take the next step. I couldn't help myself. The curiosity, the feeling that something was just beyond my reach, drove me forward. The moment my foot touched the water, I felt it. A sharp jolt of cold, as if the water was alive, reacting to my presence. I pulled back instinctively, but the chill remained, creeping up my leg, wrapping around me like a cold hand. The ripples spread outward, distorting the reflection of the trees, as if the very surface of the water was warping, bending under some unseen pressure. And then I heard it again. The sound of something beneath the water, moving. I looked down, my heart pounding in my chest. The surface was perfectly still again, too still. But I could feel it, deep in my bones, the presence of something lurking, something that shouldn't be there. I backed away slowly, my gaze never leaving the water. I knew it wasn't just a trick of the mind anymore. Something was wrong here. Something was calling me, pulling me toward the water. The footprints, the strange coldness, the movement beneath the surface, they all led to one inescapable conclusion. The swamp wasn't just a place. It was a door. And I was standing at the threshold. I turned to leave, but as I did, I noticed something else. The footprints, the deep marks in the mud, had changed. They had grown deeper, darker, as if they were being pulled into the water, as if the swamp itself was claiming them, erasing any trace of their origin. A chill ran down my spine. I had to go back. I had to warn someone. But I couldn't. The water seemed to be calling me back, urging me to stay. It was almost as if the swamp knew I had already crossed a line, and there was no turning back. As I started to turn away, I heard something. A voice, faint but distinct, whispering from the direction of the lake. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the weight of them, like they were meant for me. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. The voice was too close now, too real. I had to leave. I took one last look at the water, and without thinking, I turned and ran. The swamp seemed to stretch out endlessly before me, the trees closing in as if the world was narrowing down, pushing me toward the center of the nightmare. As I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that the swamp was alive, that it was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. And in the back of my mind, I heard the voice again, closer this time, louder and unmistakably clear. "Come closer." I stumbled, gasping for air, but I couldn't stop. Not now. I had to get out. And whatever was waiting for me in the water couldn't have me. Not today. But I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep running before the swamp claimed me too. I couldn't shake the feeling that the swamp was alive, as though the trees themselves were reaching out to stop me. The dense underbrush seemed to thicken with every step, branches curling like fingers, snapping underfoot, as though it was all trying to pull me back toward the water. The further I ran, the harder it became to breathe. The air was thick with moisture, suffocating, pressing down on my chest. Each breath felt like I was inhaling the swamp itself, damp, heavy, and sour. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following me, something hidden in the shadows of the trees. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence, broken only by my own frantic heartbeat. I stumbled through the mud, my boots sinking deeper with each step. The path that had once been familiar now seemed foreign, twisting unnaturally, as if the swamp was shifting, rearranging itself to keep me lost. The trees loomed closer now, their gnarled limbs reaching down, closing in around me like the walls of a prison. Was I running in circles? It felt like I was. The path ahead seemed to stretch on forever, but it never led me out of the swamp. I tried to call for help, but my voice was swallowed by the thick, suffocating air. The more I tried to shout, the quieter it became, until all I could hear was the pounding of my own pulse in my ears. I stopped, panting, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. There was no sound now, nothing but the ominous stillness of the swamp. It felt as though time itself had stopped. The water was far behind me, but I still felt its pull, tugging at the edges of my consciousness, like something was waiting just beneath the surface, watching. I glanced around, my heart racing as I realized how deep I had ventured into the swamp. The trees now seemed unfamiliar, their twisted forms obscured by shadows, creating a labyrinth that I couldn't escape. I needed to find a way out. I couldn't stay here, not with it still out there. I turned to retrace my steps, but something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, just the way the trees bent at angles, but then I saw it again, a shadow, not from any tree, not from any branch, but a shadow that seemed to move against the flow of light. It was too fast, too deliberate. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. The shadow shifted again, and this time I saw it more clearly, the figure of a person, hunched low to the ground, moving swiftly through the trees. But there was something wrong with the way it moved. Its limbs were too long, too bent, like it was part of the swamp itself, born from the twisted earth. I wanted to scream, to run, but the words stuck in my throat. I was paralyzed, watching as the figure came closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. It was no longer a person, not really. It was a thing, a creature that had no place in this world. Its skin was dark, slick like oil, and its eyes, if you could call them that, glowed with an unnatural light, a deep, sickly green. And then it stopped, right in front of me. Its gaze locked onto mine, and I felt a coldness seep into my bones. The shadow of the swamp had found me. I didn't know what it wanted. I didn't know what it was. But it was here, and it wasn't going away. A voice whispered in my ear, soft and raspy, like dry leaves rustling. You should have stayed away. I stumbled back, my legs weak, but the creature didn't move. It stood there, just staring at me, its eyes unblinking, its body stiff. I felt a strange compulsion to reach out, to step closer, to understand. But something in me knew better. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from it as possible. I turned and bolted, my legs moving before my mind could catch up. But as I ran, I heard it again, the voice, now louder, clearer. Come closer. The words were not a plea. They were a command. I pushed harder, the branches scraping against my face, the mud sucking at my feet, but all the while, I could feel the creature's eyes on me. The swamp was no longer just a place. It had become a trap. A place that didn't just want to hold me. It wanted to consume me. The footsteps I had seen earlier, they weren't just left by some wanderer. They were the marks of something far older, far more dangerous. I reached the edge of the swamp, the familiar roads of the park now visible ahead. I could see the safety of civilization, the lights of the park entrance shining in the distance. But as I took a step forward, the ground beneath me shifted again. The air thickened, and the distant lights flickered. I froze. The swamp wasn't just behind me anymore. It was all around me, its presence pressing against the edges of my reality. And in that moment, I realized the truth. I hadn't escaped. I had only walked deeper into its grip. The swamp was no longer just a place I had been. It was a part of me now, and there was no going back. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, heavier than before, like it was pressing against my lungs, suffocating me. The swamp had followed me, seeping into the edges of my mind, its strange, oppressive presence closing in. The path ahead should have been my escape, but I no longer felt certain of anything. The trees weren't just trees anymore. They were watchers, silent and still, but somehow aware. And I knew, deep down, that if I looked too long, they would start to move. I kept walking, but my feet were heavy. Each step felt like it was dragging me down into the earth, like the swamp was trying to pull me back. My boots made soft, with sounds as they sank into the damp ground, and the world around me seemed to be closing in. The lights from the park entrance had become distorted, flickering as though they were not real, just a mirage. I kept blinking, trying to clear the haze in front of my eyes. The path that had once seemed familiar now twisted, bending unnaturally, like it was part of the swamp itself. I felt dizzy, as though I was walking in circles, but the more I tried to find my way out, the deeper I sank into the labyrinth of the swamp. I stumbled, catching myself on a tree, and looked around. The world felt wrong. The familiar sounds of the park, the hum of cars, the rustle of leaves, were gone. Instead, there was only the sound of water, deep and steady, like the heartbeat of the swamp. And then, the whispering started again. Come closer. The voice echoed in my mind, curling around my thoughts, twisting them until they became like the vines of the swamp, entangling everything. It was the same voice from before, the creature's voice. But now, it wasn't just a voice. It was part of the air, part of the swamp itself. It was everywhere, filling every empty space. I shook my head, trying to clear it, but it didn't work. The sound of the water, the voice, the pulse, it was all connected, like a single, dark force that was pulling me deeper into its grip. I started walking again, my body moving of its own accord. My mind screamed for me to stop, to turn around and run, but my legs wouldn't listen. They carried me further into the swamp, deeper into the grip of whatever this place was. My breath was shallow, my heart pounding in my chest, but the voice, oh, the voice, was louder now, as if the swamp was speaking through it. I couldn't remember how long I had been walking. Time had lost its meaning here. The trees were no longer just trees. They were things, witnesses to things that were not meant to be seen, not meant to be understood. Suddenly, I heard a sound. It wasn't a whisper. It was a splash. The sound of something moving in the water. I froze. The footsteps. They weren't just echoes of the past. They were here, now, moving toward me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I felt the swamp closing in, the air thickening, pressing against me from all sides. The water rippled ahead, and then, from the darkness, emerged a figure. It was the creature again, standing just beyond the trees, its glowing green eyes fixed on me. But it wasn't the same. It had changed. The shadows that surrounded it twisted, extending like long, spindly limbs stretching into the darkness. It was no longer just a figure. It was something else, something vast, something ancient. Its form seemed to shift, impossible to comprehend, like a reflection in the water that couldn't decide what it was. My legs trembled, my heart thundering in my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was rooted to the spot. The voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't just words. It was a pull, a tug deep inside me, like the swamp itself was trying to drag me into its depths. "Come closer," it whispered again, only this time, the voice wasn't just in my ears. It was in my mind, in my soul. It was like a cold hand wrapping around my heart, squeezing. I tried to fight it. I tried to resist, but the swamp was stronger. It was everywhere, in everything. The water, the trees, the air, it all held me in place, as if the very land was alive, and it was hungry. The creature moved closer, its limbs stretching unnaturally, its eyes never leaving mine. And then, the ground beneath me shifted, like the earth itself was opening up, pulling me toward it. In that moment, I understood. I wasn't just lost in the swamp. The swamp had found me, had claimed me. The footprints on the water, they weren't just a sign of its presence. They were a map, a trail leading me to this moment. And now, there was no escape. The creature's hand reached out, long and skeletal, its fingers stretching toward me. I could feel its coldness, its unnatural touch, as it grasped my arm, pulling me closer. My mind screamed in protest, but there was nothing I could do. I was no longer part of the world I knew. The swamp had swallowed me whole. And then, everything went dark. When I awoke, it was different. The swamp was gone, but I knew it was still there, hidden in the layers of my mind, pressing on my thoughts. The darkness wasn't just physical. It was a weight, a suffocating presence that hung in the air like the remnants of a storm. I was lying on a soft, wet surface, the smell of the swamp still clinging to my skin, but there was no longer any sign of the creature or the twisted trees. I sat up, my head pounding, my body aching as if I had been pulled through a rift in the world. The ground was firm now, like hard-packed earth, but it felt foreign. The soft, damp earth beneath me was gone. I was somewhere else, somewhere that shouldn't exist. I glanced around, trying to make sense of it, but there were no answers. Above me, the sky was different. It wasn't the same blue I knew, nor the dull gray of the swamp sky. It was a muted, unnatural green, stretching over a vast expanse that seemed to press down on the landscape. I stood up, shaking, unsteady on my feet. Everything around me was unfamiliar. Nothing was right. The trees were different, but not in the way I'd expect. They weren't just alien in their shapes or colors. They felt wrong, as though they didn't belong to this world at all. A strange hum filled the air, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My heart quickened as I realized the hum wasn't just noise, it was alive, pulsing, almost as if it were breathing. I turned in a circle, trying to make sense of where I was, but all I saw were the same twisted, unnatural trees. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. I could almost hear the creatures whisper in my head again, that same cold, empty voice, dragging me back into the depths of the swamp. "You're here now." I shuddered, the words slipping into my mind unbidden. I clenched my fists, trying to ignore the cold dread that was creeping up my spine. But the swamp was with me, inside me now, its pulse beating in time with my own. I couldn't outrun it, couldn't escape its hold. The ground beneath me shifted again, this time more violently, and I stumbled. I looked down, horrified to see the earth crack open before me, the darkness of the swamp seeping through. It wasn't just a crack in the earth, it was a gateway, a tear between worlds. I could feel the pull, the magnetic force drawing me in. I stepped back, but I knew I wasn't free. The swamp had followed me here, and now it was opening the door for me to return. I was caught between two worlds, both bleeding into one another. I could hear voices now, voices that weren't mine, whispers of those who had disappeared, trapped just like me. They called to me, their voices soft but insistent. "Come closer. Join us." I stepped back again, my heart racing, my breath coming in short gasps. I couldn't let myself be consumed by whatever this was. I needed to find a way out, any way out. The hum intensified, and suddenly, the world around me seemed to warp. The trees bent in impossible angles, their shapes shifting like living things. The sky darkened, the green hue deepening into a sickly, blackened color, and the ground began to ripple, as if the very earth itself were alive. I turned to run, but stopped cold when I saw the reflection in the water ahead of me. It was a lake, an impossible, still lake, the surface dark as ink. And there, at the edge, was the creature. But it wasn't just standing there. It was watching me through the water, its eyes gleaming in the reflection, its skeletal form stretching, its fingers reaching toward me from beneath the surface. No, I thought. Not again. But the reflection was different this time. It wasn't a simple image, it was a doorway, a portal to the other side. I could feel it pulling me in, as though the water was alive, its surface rippling with a force that no human hand could control. I stepped closer, unable to tear my gaze away. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, their voices rising in unison. They weren't just speaking to me anymore. They were calling to me, pulling at the very fibers of my being. "Join us." The water shimmered, and I could see them, faces, shapes, figures, trapped beneath the surface, their eyes staring at me with an unspoken plea. They had been like me, once. They had walked these lands, drawn by the same twisted force. And now, they were part of it, their souls bound to the water, to the swamp that never let go. I stepped closer, my heart pounding, my hands shaking. I could feel the water's coldness radiating toward me, the hum of the swamp growing louder in my ears. The reflection was no longer just a mirror, it was an invitation, and I knew, deep down, that if I didn't act now, I would become like them. The pull was stronger now, an unrelenting force dragging me closer to the water's edge. I fought it, my body trembling, but I could feel myself slipping, falling, almost, toward the abyss. But then, In the depths of the water, I saw something that made me stop. It wasn't a face. It was a shape, a figure that had been waiting, hidden beneath the surface. And as it rose, its form distorted, shifting like liquid, I realized it wasn't just a creature. It was something else, something worse. It was the true heart of the swamp, the source of everything that had happened. The water wasn't just a passage. It was a prison. The figure reached out toward me, its fingers stretching, long and clawed, and I knew then that there was no escaping this place. It had claimed me. It would claim everyone who entered. And now, I was just another lost soul in the swamp's eternal depths. The figure's hand, if it could even be called that, dipped slowly into the water, sending ripples across the surface. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but my feet felt frozen in place. The water, that cold, dark abyss, seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, vibrating beneath my skin. Every fiber of my being told me to flee, but something about the creature, or whatever it was in the water, held me in place like a predator waiting for its prey to make the wrong move. I didn't know how long I stood there, trapped in its gaze, the sound of my breath drowned out by the growing hum that seemed to come from all around me. It wasn't just coming from the water anymore, it was in the air, in my chest, in the very fabric of my thoughts. The swamp was alive with an intelligence that felt ancient and endless. The figure in the water did not just stand still. It was watching. No, more than that. It was studying me. I felt its awareness crawling into my mind, peeling back every thought, every fear. And then the whispers began again. Join us. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My voice was stuck somewhere deep inside me, my legs too heavy to move. A sharp crack of thunder sounded in the distance, though the sky above remained still, untouched by any storm. The air shifted, heavy and thick with something unnatural. I could see the faces in the water more clearly now. They weren't the peaceful, empty faces of those lost before me. They were contorted with desperation. I saw their mouths moving, their eyes wide with terror as they reached up from the water, their hands desperately clawing at the surface, but never breaking free. They weren't trapped in the water. They were part of it. I had no more time to think. I stumbled backward, feeling the earth beneath me give way, my feet slipping into the mud. I fell hard, my body crashing against the damp earth. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. The creature, the true form of the swamp, was rising from the depths. Its shape had no clear outline, no definitive form. It was like the water itself had become its body, morphing and shifting in ways that defied logic, its tendrils of darkness reaching out, stretching toward me like fingers from a nightmare. The surface of the water swirled, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw the outline of a face, not the creature's, but something older. Something that had been watching for much longer than I could comprehend. I scrambled to my feet, panic surging through me. Every part of me screamed to run, but I couldn't find the strength. The swamp had already claimed me, and I could feel the tendrils of its power sinking deep into my bones, twisting my thoughts. Escape, I whispered to myself, though the word felt foreign on my tongue. Could I escape? Could I leave this cursed place behind? As I turned, I saw something that made my heart stop. In the distance, between the twisted trees and the creeping fog, there was a road, just a sliver of it, barely visible beneath the weight of the swamp. It was the road I had arrived on. The road I thought I had left behind. My mind raced. Could it be? Could I leave this nightmare? Could I find my way back? I bolted toward it, stumbling through the muck, the sound of the creature's roiling form growing louder behind me. The whispers were getting stronger, filling my ears until I couldn't tell where the swamp ended and my thoughts began. My vision blurred, my legs gave way, but I pushed through it, pulling myself toward the road. The distance between me and the road seemed endless. I couldn't tell how long I had been running, how long it had been since I stepped into this place. The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet with every step, as if the swamp itself were playing tricks on me, twisting my reality further. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take another step, I reached it. The road. The familiar, dull gray asphalt stretched before me, empty and silent. I had made it. But as I stood there, trembling and disoriented, something within me shifted. The air around me grew colder, the ground beneath me harder. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear my mind. The swamp was still there, but now it felt different. There was no more pull. No more whispers. I was free. But was I really? I turned around. Behind me, the swamp was gone. The trees. The fog. The lake. It was all replaced by a thick, impenetrable wall of darkness. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. The road stretched endlessly, but I could feel it, the cold, empty weight of something watching me from the darkness behind. Had I truly escaped? Or had I simply walked into another trap, another layer of this twisted reality? The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Something was wrong. The road wasn't the road I had walked on before. The trees, the sounds, the air, everything was too still. And that was when I heard it again. A low hum. A whisper. It wasn't the swamp this time. It was the road. I turned, but the road was still there, stretching out before me, empty and silent. And yet, I could feel it, a force that hadn't been there before. A presence, darker than the swamp. My chest tightened as I realized what had happened. I hadn't left. I had merely crossed into another place, another layer of this cursed world. And in that moment, I knew I would never truly escape. The road was just another part of the swamp, and I had become part of it. The City of the Abyss. It was in the middle of nowhere, a desolate stretch of land in Wyoming, far away from the nearest highway or town. The place used to be called Forsyth, a small, run-down mining community that had vanished decades ago. But when I arrived, it was as if it had never left. The air felt dense, still, as though time had stopped entirely in this forgotten part of the world. I had heard rumors, strange whispers from locals in the nearby towns that something had been happening here. Buildings that appeared overnight, structures that shouldn't have existed on any map, only to disappear again before the sun set. The stories were absurd, like something out of a bad horror novel, but I was curious. And curiosity, as I would soon learn, was a dangerous thing. The first building I noticed was a house, old, but not in a way that seemed right for a place abandoned for so long. The paint was freshly applied, the roof solid, the windows clean. Yet, there was no sign of life. No movement. I felt a chill creep up my spine. How could something like this exist here? A house in the middle of nowhere, in a town that had been long forgotten. It felt wrong. I walked closer, my boots crunching on the gravel beneath me, the sound echoing in the vast emptiness. As I reached the porch, I noticed something strange. There were no signs of wear, no dirt or dust accumulating in the corners. It was as if the house had never been abandoned. I reached for the doorknob, hesitated for a moment, and then turned it. The door swung open easily, the hinges creaking just slightly as I stepped inside. The air was stale, but it wasn't the musty, forgotten smell of an old house. It was something fresher. Something new. Inside, the furniture was simple but well kept. There was a couch, a coffee table, bookshelves filled with untouched books. A fireplace, cold and empty, sat against one wall. I could see the remnants of what might have been a family's life. Yet, there was no one. No sign of anyone having lived here, or even visited. I explored room by room, my footsteps echoing in the quiet house. The further I went, the more unsettled I became. The house was too perfect, too untouched by time. But what really disturbed me was the feeling that something was watching. Every time I turned a corner, the sensation would wash over me like a cold wave. I couldn't shake it. Finally, I made my way to the back door. It was just as pristine as the front. But when I stepped outside, I was met with something I hadn't expected. Across the yard, another building had appeared. It wasn't the house. It was a small storefront, with windows darkened by what looked like old wood planks nailed up against them. But when I looked closer, I realized something strange. The boards weren't aged. They looked freshly cut, like they had been nailed there only hours ago. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't possible. No one could build something like this so quickly, let alone in a place like Forsyth. I turned around to look back at the house, but when I did, it was gone. Gone. Just like that. The porch where I had just stood, the carefully manicured lawn, the wooden door, I couldn't see any trace of it. My heart raced as panic began to take hold. Where had it gone? What was happening? Was I losing my mind? Or was something else at play here? I turned back to the storefront. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe there was a logical explanation for it. But when I started walking toward it, the ground beneath me shifted. The earth trembled, and for a moment, I thought the entire town was going to collapse into itself. But then, everything stilled. The air grew cold, the silence oppressive. And that's when I saw it. The storefront wasn't just a building. It was a part of something. Something bigger. Something that was bleeding through into this world, into my reality, and it wasn't ready to let me leave. I stepped forward, unsure of what was waiting for me, but the moment I reached the entrance, the door swung open by itself. And there, standing in the doorway, was a figure. A man, or at least, it appeared to be one. His face was hidden by a dark hood, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching me with a gaze that sent a shiver down my spine. He stepped forward, his boots silent on the wooden floor. Before I could speak, he spoke first. This town doesn't let go. Once you're here, you'll never leave. The figure stood motionless in the doorway, his presence suffocating the air between us. I felt like I should turn and run, but my legs refused to move. His eyes, if I could even call them that, pierced me, unblinking, as though he could see right through me. The silence stretched on, an oppressive force that pressed against my chest. I could hear the faintest sound of the wind rustling through the tall grass behind me, but that was it. No birds, no distant sound of traffic or animals, nothing. I finally broke the silence. What do you mean? My voice felt foreign to me, shaky and weak. What is this place? The figure didn't move, but his voice cut through the air, low and cold, like the wind through an empty graveyard. This place doesn't exist. not in the way you think it does. It belongs to something beyond your understanding. I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Then why is it here? Why does it keep changing? His head tilted slightly, the hood shifting just enough for me to see a flash of something pale beneath. It wasn't his face, no, not exactly. It was more like a reflection, incomplete and warped. But I couldn't focus on it too long. His words were what mattered. You shouldn't have come here. Once you see it, it sees you. And once it sees you, it won't let you go. I took a step back, still unable to tear my eyes away from the doorway. Something inside me told me that I was in the middle of a nightmare that felt too real. My hand hovered over the radio on my belt, but I knew it wouldn't help. The signal here was non-existent, cut off by whatever force controlled this place. The figure raised his hand, the motion slow, deliberate. Don't try to leave, he warned, as though reading my mind. It's already too late. Before I could respond, the ground beneath me seemed to shudder again, and I stumbled. My vision blurred for a moment. When it cleared, I found myself standing in a completely different place. The storefront was gone, and I was back at the house, the one that had disappeared earlier. It hadn't vanished this time, but it didn't look right. The windows were cracked, the door slightly ajar, and there was an eerie sense that something, or someone, was waiting for me inside. I was disoriented. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening. Had I been moved? Had I somehow walked back to this spot, or had the town itself changed everything around me? Get out of here, I muttered to myself. But the words didn't feel convincing. They felt like a warning I couldn't escape. I turned back to the path that led deeper into the town. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel it. There were eyes on me from every direction. I walked toward the house, my body moving on its own, as if some force was pulling me forward. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself was resisting my every move. When I reached the porch, I stopped. I could feel it now, the air thick with something ancient. My pulse quickened, and a low hum filled my ears. Something about this place, about the town, was starting to make sense. Or rather, it was starting to not make sense. I had to find a way out. But as I reached for the doorknob, the world around me shifted again. The sky darkened, the wind picking up in a frantic swirl of dust and leaves. The house, the whole town, seemed to pulse with life, as though it were breathing. A faint whisper reached my ears, as if it was coming from the very walls around me. No one leaves. Suddenly, everything went still. I turned back toward the street, where the silhouette of the figure from earlier appeared again, standing in the distance, watching me. He hadn't moved, but somehow he was closer. His figure was more solid now, more real. I felt a shiver creep down my spine as I realized I wasn't alone anymore. This place was alive. Alive in a way I couldn't understand, and I was part of it now. I had to get out. I had to figure out how. But I wasn't sure if I still had time. The figure spoke again, his voice now clearer, almost gentle. You will stay here until the town is ready to let you go. It might take days or years, but time doesn't work the same here. You'll never know. And with that, he turned and disappeared, swallowed by the shifting mist that seemed to always linger in the distance. I stood frozen, the door to the house before me, untouched but filled with the promise of something I couldn't yet name. My mind raced, my thoughts frantically searching for answers that kept slipping through my fingers. The figure was gone, but the air still felt heavy with his words. The town itself was changing again, though not in the way I had expected. The buildings, once solid and familiar, were now shifting, stretching, as if they had forgotten their purpose. I could hear the creaking of wood, the faint sound of windows opening and closing somewhere in the distance. And yet, there was no sign of life. No footsteps on the dirt roads, no cars, not even the sound of an animal scurrying through the underbrush. It was as if the whole world had been frozen, save for me. The whispering wind and the occasional, unsettling thud of distant doors slamming shut were the only things that broke the silence. I turned and walked away from the house, my feet moving of their own accord. It was as though something, or someone, was guiding me through the ever-changing landscape. There was no clear path ahead, just a sense of direction, like an invisible hand pushing me forward. The town's layout seemed to rearrange itself with every step I took. The same streets would stretch into endless loops, places that had once seemed so familiar now felt foreign. Each corner I turned, each house I approached, felt both too close and too far away. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something greater, something beyond my comprehension. I was lost. But even as I struggled to piece together the geography of this shifting world, the strange sensation that someone was watching me never left. It was like the ground itself was aware of my every movement, every thought. I could feel it pressing in on me, tugging at the edges of my reality. The town was alive, but not in the way anything in the real world could be. It was aware of me, aware of itself, and it was bending the rules of reality to trap me. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my movement, just beyond the reach of my vision. A shadow? A figure? No, it couldn't be. But then it was gone. The place had a way of suggesting things, teasing my senses into believing something was there when, in reality, it wasn't. But I had learned quickly that nothing here was what it seemed. I was drawn to the sound of water, the faintest echo of a stream or perhaps a lake. Somewhere, in the center of this disorienting maze, there was a body of water. A place I had to go. Without thinking, I started moving toward it. The sounds grew louder as I walked, the gurgle of water mixing with a faint hum, like a far-off melody. It was a sound I knew from somewhere, but couldn't quite place. It was familiar, comforting even, but deeply wrong. The ground underfoot began to change, softening. The dirt gave way to wet, marshy soil, and the air grew thick with the scent of stagnant water. The sky above had become darker, the clouds swirling in unnatural patterns. The sun, if it could even be called that, hung low in the sky, casting everything in a muted, dim light. Soon, I reached the edge of a small, overgrown lake. The water was still, an oily sheen covering its surface. The landscape around it was strange. Dense trees twisted and reached out like clawed hands, their limbs overhanging the water, casting long, jagged shadows. And then, I saw them. Slightly below the surface, just out of reach, were shapes, figures, indistinct but solid enough to be recognized. Human shapes. They floated there, their forms distorted by the water, their eyes wide open and staring, unmoving, as though they were trapped beneath the surface. I stepped closer, mesmerized, the urge to reach out to them overwhelming. But as I stretched my hand toward the water, something in the air shifted. The ground beneath me gave a soft, ominous rumble. I turned, my heart thundering in my chest. And then, the water rippled. Slowly at first, then faster, as if the figures beneath were stirring, coming to life. The hum I had heard earlier grew louder, more distinct, as the ripples turned into waves that slammed against the shore with an unnatural force. The figures began to rise, their faces distorted by the water, their eyes never leaving mine. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled back, my legs shaking beneath me. I couldn't tear my gaze away from them. There was a moment of silence, a stillness so profound I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then, the first figure breached the surface, its face slick with water, its mouth opening in a soundless scream. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. More figures followed, emerging from the depths like corpses risen from the grave, their limbs jerking unnaturally. They were coming toward me, their eyes fixed, unblinking. I had to get away. I had to run. But the ground felt like it was holding me in place, the air pressing down on me, thickening. Every movement felt like wading through tar, slow and heavy. As they drew closer, I realized this wasn't a dream. This was real. And whatever was pulling them from the depths was pulling me, too. And then the world seemed to blink. I was no longer by the water. The figures, the lake, everything had vanished. I stood in the center of an empty street, surrounded by nothing but mist. The sky had darkened further, and the only sound was my own ragged breath. The town had changed again. I was somewhere else, or perhaps nowhere at all. And somewhere, deep inside, I knew it was still here, watching, waiting. I stood there, in the middle of the empty street, my heart hammering in my chest. The silence was unbearable, a heavy weight pressing down on me, suffocating any rational thought. The mist hung thick in the air, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. The figures by the lake had vanished, but their presence lingered, as if they had left an imprint on my mind. I tried to move, to gather myself, but my legs refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I was no longer the one in control of my actions. I forced myself to breathe slowly, the cold air stinging my lungs. I needed to think, to make sense of all of this. The town, the shifting buildings, the strange figures, the water that was somehow both deadly and inviting, it was all connected. But how? The feeling of being trapped overwhelmed me again. I turned, searching for some sign of a way out. And then I saw it, a building, newly appeared, standing at the end of the street. It was unfamiliar, unlike anything I had seen in this town before. The windows were dark, and the door was ajar, as though it had been waiting for me. Without thinking, I moved toward it, my footsteps slow and deliberate. The mist seemed to thicken with each step, wrapping around my ankles, tugging at me like a ghostly hand. As I reached the door, I hesitated. The cold metal of the handle felt wrong in my grasp, the sensation of it unnaturally smooth, as though it had been polished by 1,000 unseen hands. I turned the handle, and the door creaked open, revealing the interior. The room inside was dimly lit, the walls lined with old bookshelves and furniture covered in a thick layer of dust. There was a strange smell in the air, musty, damp, like the scent of something long forgotten. I stepped inside, my breath shallow, as if I were intruding on something that shouldn't exist. I glanced around, unsure of what I was looking for. But then I saw it, a shape in the corner, partially obscured by shadows. It was a mirror, its surface dark and distorted, as though it had been warped by time itself. The frame was ornate, with intricate carvings that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. The mirror called to me, its surface shimmering like water in the moonlight. I approached it slowly, my reflection growing clearer with each step. But as I drew closer, something about the mirror changed. My reflection, my own face, began to distort. The edges of my image blurred, as if the glass itself was bending time, pulling me into a space that wasn't quite real. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold surface. In an instant, the world around me seemed to vanish. The room, the mist, the town, they all disappeared, replaced by an endless black void. I was floating, weightless, with no sense of direction. The only thing that remained was the mirror, now an imposing figure in the darkness. I stared at my reflection, but it wasn't me anymore. The face in the glass had shifted, its features twisted, unfamiliar. It was as if the mirror was showing me something else, something darker, something that wasn't me. I tried to look away, but the reflection held me captive, my eyes locked in a trance. It smiled at me, a twisted, malicious grin that sent a chill down my spine. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, it spoke. "You're already here." The words echoed in the void, reverberating in my skull. They didn't make sense. How could I be here? How could I? Before I could finish the thought, the reflection in the mirror stepped forward. It was like the glass had become a portal, a passageway between two realities. The distorted figure reached out, its hand coming toward me, and I instinctively took a step back. But I couldn't move fast enough. The hand of my reflection, my other self, grabbed my wrist with a cold, unrelenting grip. The world around me twisted, and I was pulled toward the mirror. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the distorted smile, now stretched wide across the face of the reflection. I woke up with a gasp, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. My surroundings were familiar, but not quite right. The walls around me were cracked, the floor covered in layers of dirt and moss. The place felt ancient, as though time itself had forgotten it. I was lying in the middle of what appeared to be a dilapidated building, its windows shattered, the door hanging on its hinges. But I knew this wasn't the same town. The air was heavier here, thick with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. I scrambled to my feet, my head spinning, my body aching. The mirror, the reflection. Had it been real? Was I still in that place, caught between worlds? Or was this something else entirely? The walls of the building groaned, as if the very structure of it were alive, shifting, adapting to something unseen. The floor beneath my feet felt uneven, as though the ground itself were swallowing me whole. A noise echoed from the far end of the room, soft but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps. I turned, my heart racing. But there was no one there. Instead, a shadow moved across the far wall, long and unnatural. The shape it cast was wrong. It was too tall, too thin, too unreal. It stretched and contorted as if the wall itself were bending, the shadow following its own distorted path. And then, in the corner of my vision, I saw it. A figure, standing motionless in the doorway. It was the same figure I had seen by the lake, the same shadowed shape, its face hidden in darkness. It was watching me, waiting. The town had changed again. And this time, it was too late to escape. The figure in the doorway remained still, but its presence was overwhelming. I could feel its gaze burning into me, like the weight of 1,000 eyes, waiting for something, or perhaps demanding something. I couldn't move. My legs felt heavy, like they were rooted to the ground. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, each inhale tinged with panic. My mind raced. What is it? The figure was human in shape, but there was something off about it. It didn't belong here, just as I didn't. The shadow in the doorway shifted, almost imperceptibly. The air seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, vibrating around me like the air before a storm. I took a step back, then another. The figure didn't move, but somehow it was getting closer. I didn't understand. Was this the town pulling me deeper into itself? Was this another one of those fleeting structures that appeared and vanished in a blink? Or was I stuck in a parallel reality that was now bending to its will? I reached for the walls, my fingers brushing against the cold, crumbling surface, but there was nothing to hold on to. The space around me seemed to expand, stretching into a vast, disorienting emptiness, swallowing the room. It felt as though the entire building was sinking into the ground beneath me, slowly being devoured by the earth. I turned my eyes back to the doorway. The figure was closer now, too close. It stood just a few feet away, its body still cloaked in darkness, its face hidden, but I could sense it was looking directly at me. The silence was suffocating. It stretched on endlessly, and with it, the terror began to creep up on me like a slow tide. I couldn't speak, couldn't scream. I was completely paralyzed. And then, in that deafening silence, I heard a sound, a soft, unearthly whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Come closer." The voice echoed through my skull. It was both calm and commanding. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Against every instinct in my body, I stepped forward. I couldn't stop myself. The voice was in my mind, pulling me forward, dragging me into the presence of that figure in the doorway. The room around me continued to warp, the walls stretching and twisting as if reality itself was unraveling. I moved closer, my legs trembling with each step. The figure's form solidified in my vision, though its features remained concealed in shadow. I could feel the temperature drop, the air growing colder with each passing second. The ground beneath me seemed to soften, almost like it was becoming liquid, like I was sinking into it. I reached the doorway. And then, finally, I saw its face. It wasn't a face at all. It was an absence. A void where features should have been, a deep, endless darkness that seemed to draw in all the light around it. I staggered backward, horrified. But the shadow followed. It seemed to expand, swallowing everything in its path. The walls, the floor, the sky, all were consumed by the darkness, leaving only the absence, a void so complete, so infinite, that I felt myself being pulled into it. "You should not have come," the voice whispered, now closer than ever. It was not a warning. It was a statement, a fact. The darkness wrapped around me, suffocating and cold. I tried to run, but there was no escape. The ground had disappeared beneath me. I was floating, trapped in an endless void, the figure now nowhere to be seen, but its presence still pressing down on me. In the distance, I thought I saw something. A light. It flickered, far away, a fragile beacon in the overwhelming darkness. I reached toward it instinctively. Maybe it was the way out, the escape I so desperately needed. But as I stretched my arm forward, the void began to shift again. The light was now moving toward me. And it was not a beacon of hope. The light became brighter, closer, until it was right in front of me. I couldn't stop myself. The darkness tugged me forward, forcing me into the light. As I passed through it, everything around me fractured. I was back in the town. But it wasn't the same. The buildings, once fleeting, had now taken permanent form, their outlines sharp and defined, as if they had always been here. The streets were too quiet, unnervingly still. The mist hung in the air like a shroud, thick and impenetrable. And there, at the end of the street, was the figure again, standing motionless, watching me. But this time, I wasn't the one trapped. It was. For the first time, I realized what had happened. I hadn't been pulled into the town. The town had pulled me into it, and now it had locked me here. I was part of it now, one of the others. The ones who didn't belong. The ones who vanished. I turned to run, but the ground beneath me began to tremble. The buildings around me shifted, their outlines flickering like faulty light bulbs. The air grew heavier, and the mist closed in tighter, suffocating me. And then, with a sudden, brutal force, I was pulled under, into the earth itself. The last thing I felt was the cold embrace of the ground, a dark and unyielding grip that swallowed everything, taking me into the unknown. And then, silence. Ghosts among the skies. Montana had always been a place of solitude and rugged beauty. But for me, as a pilot, it was more than just a place, it was home. The wide open skies, the unbroken landscapes, the mountains that stretched far beyond the horizon. It was where I had come to seek peace, and it was where I had found my purpose. I was flying solo that day, a routine check on the airfield just outside Billings. The winds were calm, the sky clear, bright blue. It was a perfect afternoon for a flight. But something about the air felt off. It wasn't the weather. It wasn't the plane. It was something else. Something I couldn't put my finger on. The radio crackled, cutting through the silence in the cockpit. Pilot in the area, this is Tower. You seeing anything unusual? I frowned, adjusting the dials. My hand hovered over the controls as I glanced out at the vast, open sky. There was nothing. Not a cloud in sight. Negative, Tower. All clear on my end, I responded, voice steady, though the unease gnawed at me. The tower's reply came a moment later, but it was different. More urgent. We've got reports coming in about some strange objects in the sky. Keep your eyes peeled. The line went silent after that, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Strange objects in the sky. It could be anything, I reasoned. A flock of birds, a distant plane, maybe even a weather balloon. But as I looked out over the horizon, I felt an unsettling sense that I wasn't alone up here. I scanned the sky again, nothing but the endless expanse of blue stretching out in all directions. But then, just as I turned my attention back to the controls, I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, an object darting quickly across the sky, too fast for me to make out any details. I adjusted my flight path, eyes locked on the spot where I had seen the movement. And then, there it was again, this time clearer. A dark, angular shape, hovering motionless in the air. I froze. It wasn't an airplane. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't anything I had ever seen before. The object was too large to be a drone, and it seemed to defy the natural laws of flight. It moved without sound, without disturbance in the air. It just hung there, like a dark, unnatural presence against the backdrop of the vast sky. I reached for the radio, hands shaking now. This is Pilot. I've got a visual on something strange in the sky. I don't know what it is. The voice on the other end crackled back almost immediately. Copy that, Pilot. Stay clear of it. We've had other reports. It's not safe. My heart raced. It was getting closer. I could feel it, something was drawing me in, pulling me toward that object. I knew I should have turned back. I knew I should have aborted the flight and returned to the airstrip. But curiosity, no, fear, kept me glued to the controls. I watched as the object shifted, slowly at first, then faster, darting across the sky with terrifying agility. It was now directly in my path. My hands gripped the yoke tighter, my mind racing. What was it? What did it want? And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the object vanished. One moment it was there, and the next, nothing. The sky was empty again. The only sound was the hum of my engine, the beat of my pulse in my ears. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Tower, I spoke slowly, my voice trembling despite myself. It's gone. Just disappeared. There was a long pause before the response came, strained and uneasy. Copy that, pilot. Stay in the air for now. We've lost contact with another plane in the area. We need you to stay sharp. My stomach twisted. Another plane? My gaze flickered to the instruments, double-checking everything. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary. But something was wrong. The feeling deep in my gut told me that this wasn't over. I turned the plane around, heading back toward the airfield, but as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I looked up again. The sky was still empty. But I knew now, whatever had been up there wasn't gone. It was just waiting. The radio crackled again, interrupting my thoughts. Pilot, listen carefully. We've just had a report of a downed aircraft in your vicinity. We need you to change course immediately and head back to the base. Before I could respond, the radio went silent. I glanced down at the map, trying to process the new order. But then, just as I turned back to the sky, I saw it again, the shape. This time, it was closer, directly above me, casting an unnatural shadow across the plane. I couldn't escape. The engine sputtered. And then, everything went dark. I woke up disoriented, my senses slow to return. The air around me was thick with tension, the hum of the engine gone. The cold, metallic smell of the cockpit mingled with the faint scent of burning rubber. My heart hammered in my chest. I had to move, but my body refused to respond. I blinked, forcing myself to focus. The first thing I noticed was that the sky was no longer the bright blue I had seen just moments before. It was an unsettling gray, heavy with clouds that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. And the landscape below me, what had happened to it? I was no longer flying over the wide open spaces of Montana. The ground beneath me was unfamiliar. A sprawling forest of dense trees. Not a field. Not a road. Just an endless sea of dark green stretching out as far as I could see. What in the world? I tried to regain control of the plane, but the controls were unresponsive. I checked the dials. The engines were still on. The altitude gauge read steady, but everything else was a blur of numbers and strange readings. Tower, this is pilot. Come in. Do you copy? Nothing. No static, no response. Just the dead silence of the radio. My hands gripped the controls with a cold sweat as the plane drifted lower, its descent slow but undeniable. I could see the trees now, so close that I could make out their individual branches and leaves. And then, there it was again. The dark shape. Hovering in the sky, unmoving. Watching. It had been following me since the first encounter, I realized. I couldn't explain how, but I knew it was connected to what had happened to me. To the plane's malfunction, to the strange shift in the world around me. Not again, I whispered to myself. I pulled on the yoke, trying to climb higher, but it was useless. The plane was locked in place, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't change its trajectory. My mind raced. What was I supposed to do? What had just happened to me? Was I in some kind of time slip? A parallel world? This couldn't be real. Nothing made sense. The shape moved again. This time, it wasn't alone. Another object appeared beside it, then another. They were forming a pattern in the sky, like a constellation of shifting, dark silhouettes. Each one moved with purpose, not like a bird or a plane, but something altogether different. The way they moved, so fluid, so unnatural, it sent a chill straight through my bones. I tried the radio once more, desperation creeping into my voice. Tower, please. I need help. I don't know where I am. I need someone to. The voice on the other end was calm, too calm. Pilot, we're aware. Do not attempt to land. Whatever is happening, it's not what it seems. Stay where you are. We've lost contact with several other planes. You're not alone up there. I stared at the radio, shocked, my mind struggling to process the words. What do you mean, I'm not alone? I asked, barely able to breathe. No response. The silence on the other end was deafening. Suddenly, the plane lurched, and I was thrown against my seat. I gasped, struggling to regain control. My eyes shot back to the objects in the sky. They were no longer hovering. They were closing in on me, faster than I thought possible. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. The first object was right in front of me now, so close I could see its shape more clearly, dark and angular, but with an unsettling sheen, like it was made of something both solid and translucent at the same time. I couldn't explain it, but the very presence of it filled me with dread. The plane dipped again. This time, I couldn't pull it up. I heard a loud crack, like metal bending under immense pressure. And then, nothing. The engine cut out completely. I was falling. The ground rushed up at me. The trees were now a blur of green, and the sky a chaotic swirl of dark shadows and unnatural light. I braced for impact, knowing there was no chance of survival if I hit the earth at this speed. But before I could even think, everything froze. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The plane stopped, suspended in midair. I looked up again. The dark shapes had gathered around me now, close enough that I could see the outline of what appeared to be figures. Shapes that were not just in the sky, but somehow connected to it, merging with the clouds and the light, twisting and shifting in ways that defied any natural law I knew. And then, in the center of it all, one of them spoke. It was not a voice. It wasn't even a sound. It was a thought, a voice inside my mind, so clear and cold that it sent a shiver down my spine. You are not meant to be here. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Panic clawed at my chest as the shapes closed in further. The words echoed in my head, growing louder until they consumed every thought I had. You will never leave. The world around me felt warped, as if reality itself had been twisted and was no longer obeying any of its usual rules. The plane, suspended in midair, felt like a fragile speck in a vast, unseen force. I could barely move, the sensation of paralysis taking over my limbs. The sky was no longer the sky I knew, but an endless sea of dark, swirling clouds and shifting shadows. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't form. The thought that had been forced into my mind, the warning, echoed over and over, rattling inside my skull. You are not meant to be here. The shapes, or figures, that surrounded me were not truly visible in the traditional sense. They weren't physical in the way I understood things to be. They were projections, reflections, ripples in the fabric of the air itself. They existed in the periphery, always shifting just outside the corner of my eye. When I turned to look directly at them, they were gone. But I could feel them. I could feel their presence like an ice-cold hand on the back of my neck. The voice in my head didn't come again, but its influence remained, a steady, ominous pressure. My breath quickened as I tried to understand, tried to reason. Where had I gone? What was this place? What were these things? Nothing made sense. The fabric of time and space around me felt wrong. Like a dream, or worse, a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I tried to regain control of the plane once more. My hands shook as I gripped the controls, but they were unresponsive. The instruments flickered, the readings going haywire, and the plane hung in place, floating in an abyss. I turned my gaze back to the shapes. They were closer now, moving with a precision that made my heart race. My mind screamed for me to do something, anything. But there was no escape. And then, in the deepest part of my mind, I understood. This wasn't just an accident. This wasn't a freak occurrence. They had been waiting. They had always been here. I wasn't in Montana anymore. No, I wasn't even in the same reality. I had crossed some boundary, some invisible line that shouldn't have been crossed, and I was now trapped in a place that was not mine to understand. The figures closed in, not in a rush, but slowly, methodically, as though they were savoring my terror. I could feel them watching, studying me. The chill in the air deepened. I could see faint glimmers of their outlines now, dark, impossible shapes that defied description, with angles that bent in unnatural ways, flickering in and out of existence as if they were the very embodiment of the unknown. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but no words came. The silence surrounding me was suffocating, pressing down on my chest. What do you want from me? I thought, desperate for any answer. A response came. Not in words, but in feelings, deep, unsettling emotions that coursed through my mind like a river of ice. You cannot leave. I wanted to argue, to yell, to demand answers, but the thoughts flooded my mind too quickly. The more I tried to resist, the stronger the pressure became. You are here to stay. The world around me began to shimmer and warp, the sky twisting as the shapes closed in tighter. I fought with every ounce of strength, pushing against the invisible force that held me in place. I needed to escape, but there was nowhere to go. And then, as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The plane, the sky, the figures, they all vanished in an instant. I blinked, disoriented, gasping for air as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. But the tightness in my chest, the cold sweat on my skin, and the overwhelming sense of dread told me otherwise. I was still in the air. Still in my plane. But it was different now. Everything around me was still. Too still. I checked the instruments. The plane was still intact, the engines running fine, though the readings were once again out of sync, fluctuating wildly. My eyes shot out the window, searching for any sign of the figures, but there was nothing. The sky had returned to its normal shade of blue. The ground was the familiar terrain of Montana. Was it over? Had I imagined it? No. No. I knew what I had felt. What I had seen. What I had heard. But there was no time to think. A faint sound caught my attention, a distant hum, a soft vibration that filled the air around me. It was impossible to pinpoint the source, but it was there, insistent and deep, as though something beneath the earth was stirring. My pulse quickened as I scanned the horizon once more. Something was coming. It was no longer a question of what I had seen. It was a question of how long I had before it returned. And what would happen when it did. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The plane felt heavier in the air now, as if the very atmosphere had thickened around me. The hum was growing louder, more pronounced, vibrating through the fuselage, sending a chill down my spine. I tried to steady my breathing, tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me after everything I had witnessed. But the hum didn't stop. It was like a heartbeat, slow and methodical, thumping in time with the rhythm of my own. I checked the radar again. No planes, no blips, no signs of anything. The ground beneath me seemed as ordinary as it could be, just the endless wilderness of Montana stretching out below. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew something was coming, and I wasn't going to escape it this time. I gripped the controls harder, trying to focus. The instrument panel flickered again, and I cursed under my breath as I tried to adjust the dials. It felt like the plane was becoming more and more unresponsive, as if something was blocking the signals. It was as if the plane itself was being sucked into something I couldn't see. That's why I saw it. A shape in the distance, small at first, almost imperceptible against the endless sky. It was just a flicker of movement, but it was there. And it was coming closer. I leaned forward, narrowing my eyes. At first, I thought it was another plane, perhaps another pilot in the area. But no! This was different. The shape was erratic, like a shifting blur, a twisting line that seemed to defy the laws of flight. No, I thought, this can't be real. The shape grew larger, and I could make out a faint glow around its edges. It wasn't a conventional aircraft, no wings, no engine sounds. Just this unsettling shimmer, like something from another world. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The hum grew louder, vibrating through my chest. My pulse quickened as I realized the truth. The figure was heading straight for me. Panic surged in my chest, but I pushed it down. I had to think. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here and wait for it to reach me. I snapped to attention, pulling the controls hard to the right, trying to change course. But the plane didn't respond. It felt as if an invisible hand was pushing it back, forcing it to stay on its current trajectory. No, 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 no. The shape was closer now, much closer. It wasn't just a shape anymore. It was a figure, a being, its edges glowing faintly in the sky. It was surrounded by a shimmering aura, as if it existed in a different plane of reality altogether, one that was flickering in and out of focus. I could hear a low hum now, not just in the plane but in my mind. A soft, resonant frequency, like a message, one I couldn't understand. But I could feel it. It was alien, incomprehensible, yet somehow familiar. The figure was nearly upon me. It was large, larger than any aircraft I had ever seen. Its outline bent and shifted, as if the laws of geometry didn't apply. The very air around it seemed to warp and bend, rippling like water. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My hands gripped the controls tighter, but it was pointless. The hum was deafening now, echoing in my ears, and my vision started to blur. The world outside the cockpit was disappearing into a wash of light and shadow. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The plane jolted violently, throwing me against my seat. I gasped, clutching the seatbelt as the world around me spun into chaos. The hum stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring, the kind that feels like it's pressing against your skull as if the world itself is holding its breath. I took a shaky breath, trying to collect myself. I glanced at the instruments again. Everything was normal. The radar was clear. The skies were empty. But I knew that something had changed. It wasn't over. I wasn't safe. And then, as I looked back at the horizon, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Another shape. Smaller, but unmistakably there. It was following me. I wasn't alone. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. The plane was feeling heavier, its controls sluggish, as if something unseen was slowly dragging it down. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. How could this be happening? What were those things? What were they doing to me? The figure that had appeared out of nowhere was still in my thoughts, its eerie glow seared into my mind like an afterimage. It hadn't just been a hallucination. I knew it hadn't. I wasn't imagining it. I had felt its presence, the hum of its being, vibrating in my bones. The second shape was closer now, just barely visible in the corner of my eye. It wasn't like the first one, it was smaller, more subtle, but it was following me, maintaining a constant distance, as if it knew exactly where I was going. I couldn't tell if it was just an echo of the first one, a copy, or if it was something worse, something even more malevolent. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting. It was like the eyes of some great predator, hidden in the vast expanse of the sky, always watching, always waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I snapped my head back to the front. No more distractions. I needed to land. I needed to get out of the air. Now. My hands trembled as I gripped the controls. The landscape below me stretched endlessly, familiar but suffocating. I could almost feel the weight of the earth pulling at me, trying to drag me down. There was something wrong with the air, something oppressive, like it was filled with static, vibrating with an unseen force. The hum returned, louder this time, echoing in my skull. It wasn't coming from the aircraft. It was coming from inside me, a frequency that I couldn't block out. I felt like I was being pulled apart at the seams, like my very atoms were being shaken loose by the force of it. I had to get out. The nearest airstrip was just ahead. I could see it, small, isolated, just a strip of pavement surrounded by the endless expanse of Montana's wilderness. If I could make it there, I could land, get to safety, and figure out what was happening. But as I drew closer, I saw it. The runway wasn't empty. There was something there, something large, something dark. A silhouette against the setting sun, blocking the runway. It was too still, too solid to be a person or an object. The hum intensified, rattling through my body, twisting my insides into knots. The figure on the runway was impossible. It wasn't just standing there, it was growing, stretching, and contorting in ways that made no sense. It was warping, bending, like the world around it was distorting to make space for it. I slammed my fist against the dashboard. No! I wasn't landing. I couldn't. The figure grew larger, taller, its shape expanding like some twisted shadow. And then, I saw it, the telltale flicker of movement. Another one. Another one was appearing, right beside the first, its body twisting in unnatural ways. I pulled back on the throttle, yanking the plane into a steep climb, desperately trying to gain altitude. The noise inside the cockpit was unbearable now. The hum had become a roar, filling every inch of the cabin. It was all-encompassing, deafening. But no matter how high I climbed, no matter how fast I pushed the throttle forward, the figures kept rising with me. They were closing in, surrounding me, their presence suffocating, overwhelming. I could feel them, their eyes, their intent, pressing into my mind like cold hands on my skull. I could hear their whispers now, low and guttural, unintelligible but unmistakably threatening. The words felt like nails scraping against my thoughts, dragging me into madness. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, my heart pounding against my ribs. My vision blurred, the edges of the cockpit warping as the world around me folded in on itself. I needed to land. I needed to escape. But the ground was getting farther away, slipping further into the distance, and the figures were everywhere. They weren't just in the sky, they were inside the plane with me now. Their presence was everywhere. Their whispers echoed in my mind, louder and louder. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the hum. I couldn't hear myself. The world was dissolving into noise and light and shadow, and I was trapped, caught in the middle of it all. Then, the plane jerked violently, and everything went black. And that was the last thing I remember. When I woke up, there was nothing. Just a cold silence, and the heavy weight of the earth beneath me. But there was something strange about the silence. It wasn't just quiet. It was empty. I looked around. The plane had vanished. I was alone in the sky. The man without a body. I don't know how to begin this. Maybe I shouldn't even be writing it at all, but I can't stop myself. There's something in me, something I can't shake, and if I don't let it out, I'm afraid I'll lose my mind entirely. It started on a quiet night in South Carolina, the kind of night that seemed peaceful enough. I was walking home from a late shift at the diner when I first felt it. A strange sense of being watched, like eyes were on me, but not from where they should have been. The usual sounds of the evening, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, had stopped. Everything was eerily still. Too still. The air felt thick, like it was holding its breath. I turned down an empty street, passing by the same houses I'd walked by 1,000 times, when I heard it. A faint whisper, like the wind trying to carry a secret. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, maybe the wind playing tricks. But then it came again, louder this time, and it wasn't the wind at all. You can't escape. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around, expecting to see someone hiding in the shadows, but there was no one. Just empty streets, empty houses. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing in my ears, crawling under my skin. I shook my head. It had to be my mind playing tricks on me. I hadn't gotten enough sleep lately. Stress, maybe. That's all. Nothing to worry about. But as I quickened my pace, the whispers followed. They grew louder, clearer, and with them came an unsettling feeling of presence. Something was out there. Something was following me, waiting. The shadows between the streetlights seemed to stretch and twitch, as if they were alive, bending toward me like tendrils reaching out from the dark. I kept walking faster, trying to ignore the rising panic, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Just my mind running wild. When I reached my house, I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my hands trembling as I bolted the locks. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, trying to calm down. Nothing was out there. Nothing. It was all in my head. But that night, the whispers didn't stop. The next day, I woke up feeling strange. My head was foggy, and my limbs felt heavier than usual. At first, I thought I was just tired, work had been exhausting, and the stress was wearing me down. But as the day went on, things began to feel off in a way I couldn't explain. The whispers came again, but this time they weren't in the air. They were in my mind. A voice, so soft at first I thought I was imagining it, speaking to me while I was alone in the kitchen, while I was sitting at my desk, even while I was out walking. It spoke in a language I didn't understand, yet I could feel it like a pressure on my chest, suffocating me. It's already begun. I couldn't focus on anything. My thoughts kept getting interrupted, and my body felt wrong. Like it wasn't entirely mine anymore. It was as if something was pulling at my muscles, my bones, directing me to move in ways I didn't want to move, as if something invisible was guiding me. At first, I chalked it up to stress. Maybe I was losing my mind. But then things started happening, strange things. I would wake up in a different position than I remembered, as if I'd gotten out of bed and moved around in my sleep. My hands would twitch uncontrollably, making me drop things or fumble with objects I was holding. The worst part was when I'd look into the mirror. There was nothing wrong with the reflection, but something was missing. I couldn't explain it, but the reflection felt distant, detached. Like I wasn't really there, like the person staring back at me wasn't fully me. I'd see myself, but it was like I was looking through a window at someone who wasn't quite real. I thought I was just imagining it. But then, the whispers came again. Clearer this time. More insistent. You're not alone. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know if it was a warning or a threat, but it didn't matter. Something was happening. Something I couldn't control. And it was getting worse. That evening, I went out for a walk to clear my head. The air was humid, thick with the heat of the day that never seemed to quite let go at night. The streets were quieter than usual, and I walked without thinking, following the road as if my feet were moving on their own. The whispers followed me again, swirling around me, teasing me. But this time, they were joined by something else. A sensation. It was like I could feel someone behind me. The feeling of being watched, except this time, it was more intense. It was like a weight pressing against me, as though something invisible was following my every step. I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone there, but there was nothing. Only the empty street stretching back into the shadows. The feeling didn't go away. It was getting stronger, the pressure on my chest increasing with every step. I knew I wasn't alone. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure. It wasn't like any person I'd seen before. It was too still. Too perfect. Its outline was barely there, like a shadow that hadn't been fully formed. But its presence was undeniable. It was there. And it was moving toward me. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. It was like I was stuck in place, unable to move, unable to escape. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. The message was clear. It was coming for me. The figure continued to move toward me, slow and deliberate, its presence filling the air with a palpable heaviness. Every step it took seemed to stretch the seconds into an eternity. The pressure in my chest intensified, suffocating me, making it harder to breathe. My body froze, as if paralyzed by fear, unable to tear my eyes away from it. I tried to scream, but my throat felt tight, my voice lost in the panic that was rising inside me. The figure didn't make a sound, but its shadow, if it could even be called that, moved unnaturally, flickering in and out of focus, like a mirage in the corner of my vision. I blinked, and for a brief moment, the figure was gone. I gasped, looking around desperately. The street was empty again, the only sound my rapid breathing. But the unease hadn't faded. I could still feel it, the presence, clinging to me, following me in the darkness. Had I imagined it? Was it just the stress? The whispers had grown louder, more frantic now, echoing in my mind. They were no longer just whispers, but a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, urging me to do something, to move, to run. I stumbled backward, half mad with fear, trying to process what was happening. Was I losing my mind? Was I being haunted? But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was behind me, it wasn't human. It wasn't something I could escape. My phone buzzed in my pocket, jerking me from my spiraling thoughts. I pulled it out with trembling hands, praying for some semblance of normalcy. Maybe a text from a friend. A distraction. It was a message from my mother. Her words were simple, but they sent a chill through me. Be careful. Something's not right. It's in the house. My heart stopped. I hadn't told her anything about what was going on. There was no way she could have known. I quickly dialed her number, my hand shaking as I pressed the phone to my ear. It rang once, twice, before it went to voicemail. Mom? Mom, answer me. I hung up and called again, but this time I didn't wait for the voicemail. I raced toward home, my footsteps echoing in the night. The streets had never felt so long. Every shadow seemed to reach for me, every flicker of movement in the corner of my eye setting my nerves on fire. The whispers returned, louder now, sharper, as if they were coming from all around me. You can't run. You can't hide. I reached the front door, my pulse hammering in my ears, and yanked it open. The house was dark. Too dark. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, but everything else was silent. Too silent. Mom? I called out, my voice breaking. No answer. I stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind me with an unnatural force, like it had been pushed from the inside. I shivered, feeling the temperature drop as if the house had become colder in the span of seconds. The whispers were louder now, coming from everywhere. I stumbled forward, my legs unsteady as I made my way through the darkened house. It's here. The voice was unmistakable now, and it wasn't in my mind. It was in the air, hanging like a cloud around me. I reached the living room. The lights flickered on by themselves, bathing the room in a sickly yellow glow. And there, standing in the middle of the room, was the figure. It was clearer now, its shape no longer flickering or fading. It was tall, taller than any man I had ever seen, its limbs unnaturally long, its body hollow and dark like a void that sucked in all light. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, featureless surface that seemed to shift and bend as though it was made of shadow. And then I saw it, my mother, standing beside it. But something was wrong. Her eyes were vacant, dull, her expression blank, like she wasn't there at all. She was possessed. She wasn't herself. "Mom!" I screamed, reaching for her, but before I could take a step, the figure reached out and grabbed her arm, pulling her toward it. Her body jerked with unnatural force, and she let out a hollow scream that echoed in my head. "No! Please!" I cried, my voice cracking. But the figure only tilted its head, and the room grew colder still. In a blur of motion, it turned its attention to me. The whispers surged in intensity, almost deafening now. I felt my body move of its own accord, my legs carrying me forward toward the figure. I tried to stop, tried to scream, but I couldn't. My body no longer obeyed my commands. It was controlling me, using my body against my will, just as it had done to my mother. I reached out, as if compelled to do so, and the figure's hollow gaze turned toward me. The void where its face should have been seen to swallow me whole. And then, the final whisper came. "You are already ours." Everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Time seemed to bend in that moment, stretching and compressing all at once. When I finally opened my eyes, I found myself lying on the cold floor of my living room, breathing in shallow gasps as though I had been underwater for an eternity. I sat up, my head pounding, my mind foggy. The house was silent now, eerily so. The lights above flickered once more before going out entirely, plunging me back into darkness. My heart raced in my chest as I slowly stood, unsure of what I was about to find. The figure was gone. But that didn't bring me relief. In fact, it only made the situation worse. The whispers were gone too. But in their place was an unsettling silence that pressed in on me from every direction, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The house felt wrong, off, like a dream I couldn't wake from. I staggered toward the door, desperate to leave, to find any escape from the nightmare I had become trapped in. As I reached for the handle, something in the corner of my eye caught my attention. A figure. No, it wasn't a figure. It was me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. In the hallway, just beyond the door, was my reflection, or at least it should have been. But it wasn't me, not entirely. It was distorted, twisted. My face was gaunt, my eyes hollow and sunken, staring back at me with an expression that wasn't mine. I could feel it, the emptiness behind that reflection, the dark void that had taken residence in my mind. I stumbled back, hands reaching for my face as though trying to reassure myself that I was still human, that I was still me. But it didn't help. The mirror image mimicked my movements, but there was something wrong, something about the way it moved. It didn't follow my every motion. It waited. It watched. "It's not you," I whispered to myself. But my voice trembled with doubt. A movement at the edge of the hallway made me turn, and for a moment, I saw it again, the figure. It stood at the end of the hall, just out of reach, yet closer than ever. Its body was stretched, its form like liquid shadow, dripping and shifting in the dim light. And then it spoke, not with words, but with a voice that rang in my skull, seeping into my thoughts. "You can never leave." I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the floor, desperate to escape the weight that crushed down on my chest, the feeling that something was pulling me back, forcing me to stay. I reached the door again. My hand trembled as I tried to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. I heard a soft click, like something was unlocking from the inside. The door swung open, but it wasn't the street outside that greeted me. No, it was another room. Another hallway that stretched on forever. I stepped back, horrified. The figure loomed behind me now, its form spreading like ink in water. The voices came again, rising up like a tidal wave, crashing against my thoughts. It was all around me. It was in me. You cannot escape. My body moved again, against my will, dragging me toward the dark hallway. I struggled, tried to fight it, but it was useless. I wasn't controlling my body anymore. It was as if I had become a passenger, helpless in the face of whatever was pulling the strings. And then, I understood. The figure wasn't just following me. It wasn't just haunting me. It was me. It had taken control of my body, my mind, and now it was taking everything. The hallway stretched on, endless. I could see the light flickering in the distance, but it was fading, receding into the blackness. I had become the reflection. I was the one trapped now, in the endless loop, always running but never escaping. I was the thing that could never leave. The darkness closed in. I could feel the walls closing in around me, the oppressive silence suffocating every breath I tried to take. The darkness was no longer just in front of me, but inside me, penetrating my thoughts, pulling at my mind until it felt like my very essence was being consumed. The figure, the thing that was me, had taken full control, its presence now inside my skin, beneath my bones, and within my very soul. I could hear its voice, whispering through my mind, taunting me. You are mine now. Forever. My own hands moved involuntarily, reaching out for the light that flickered at the end of the hallway. But as I stumbled forward, the light dimmed, as if rejecting me, as if it could sense what I had become. My body continued to move, but it wasn't me anymore. It was the thing that had replaced me. The shadow that wore my face, my body, my life. In the distance, I saw something else, someone. A figure standing in the dark, shrouded in the same unnatural silence. It was an echo of me, or perhaps a reflection of the person I used to be. The figure stepped closer, and I recognized it, her. My mother. The woman who had always warned me about the darkness, about the things that lurked just beyond the veil of reality. She had always told me that there were things in this world that we could never understand, things that could take root inside of us and never let go. I reached out, wanting to speak to her, to ask her how to stop this, how to break free. But my voice was silent. No words came. The shadow that had become me just stood there, watching, waiting, as if it were savoring my agony. You can't fight it, my mother's figure whispered, though it was not her voice. It was the voice of the thing that had taken over me. You never could. I reached out, desperate to break free from the grasp of the shadow. But instead of my hand making contact with the figure, my fingers brushed against the cold surface of a mirror. I looked up in terror, and there it was, me. Not just the twisted reflection from before, but the full horror of it. The creature that wore my face, my identity, my humanity, grinning back at me with a malevolent smile. This is who you are now, it said, its voice echoing through every inch of my being. This is your end. The room began to warp, the edges of reality blurring as the figure stepped closer, its form stretching and twisting until it consumed everything in sight. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me whole was my own face, staring at me with empty eyes. And then, nothing. I don't know how long I was lost in that void, or if I was ever truly alive after that moment. But when I woke, I was standing in a room I didn't recognize, my body completely still, as though I had been frozen in time. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the walls seemed to pulse with the same energy that had consumed me. I raised my hands to my face, trembling. My reflection was still there, myself, staring back at me with hollow eyes. But then, something changed. A figure appeared behind me, stepping from the shadows. I didn't need to turn around to know what it was. The air shifted, the same cold presence that had haunted me now standing just inches away. I knew in that moment that I hadn't escaped. I had become part of it. And now, it was my turn to watch. To wait. To become the one who would never leave. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.